Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the show. It's the INN podcast, and we are honoured today to have Dr. James Lewthwaite, who is the chairman of the British Democrats UK. It's a political party that is very promising, and I've been hoping to get James on for a little while now. We've got some really great content to go through. We've got quite a strong itinerary. We are looking at the focus will be on the future of British politics, policies within the British Democrats, the coming energy crisis, homelessness, veterans, also tied in with homelessness, James's personal views and political party views on the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum. And then finally, just wanted to touch on how these guys feel about the sexualization of our children and also adult content being pushed into curriculums and also the day-to-day lives of children. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. James Lewthwaite. Welcome, James.
I'm usually referred to as Jim, actually. Joe, at least by anybody that knows me within the political field, I'm Jim Lewthwaite, not Dr. James. But thank you very much for giving me the full title, as it were.
Do you mind if I'll call you Jim from now on in the podcast? So it's easier for me as well, to be honest. I'm a bit more of a relaxed guy than that. But yeah, no, absolute pleasure to have you here, James. I watched your video, the 20-minute address that you did in London. Was it last month that you did that?
It was some time ago, I think. I've very little recollection of the event now because it seems that we're in the distant past. So much has happened since. We've had many more people join us, and I try to speak to each one. So after a while, it becomes a bit blurred.
Brilliant. Well, I have to say, from our side, there was very little comeback with regards to that talk. I mean, you spoke deeply to a lot of people surrounding me and a lot of people who would generally be quite difficult to sway, but they sat down and they watched the 20-minute video, and I was half expecting them to come back with a sort of with a grouping of questions and objections, as they usually do, because they have a habit of always finding an objection, but actually what came back was very positive, and a lot of the usual suspects that I would expect to sort of have a different opinion of it were actually very supportive of it, Jim. So that's a really good indicator that you guys are onto a sort of a popular sort of position within politics, and a very sensible one as well. I mentioned to you in previous conversations that sort of listening through that video for the 20 minutes, I found that the way that we are building the Independent Nationalist Network and working with other organisations, working with other individuals, never working for someone but happy to work with people, and just sort of going through that whole video with you, it's almost kind of, light bulb moments were popping every few moments and thinking, gosh, this is so similar to the way that we built the INN, for the same reasons that you built the British Democrats, to combat a lot of the problems that you've seen in the past. So it seems like we're two sort of organisations that are kind of have the same sort of mind frame, of making a better version of what's been before and kind of getting over a lot of the problems within that. Would you agree?
Absolutely. If I could define the BDP's position very simply, we try to maintain the good parts of the BNP, which was immensely popular. If you remember back in the day, in the early 2000s, the BNP was massively popular among ordinary people. Very significantly, the policies, if the policies were presented to people, the majority of people accepted them. When they were told that there were BNP policies, given the amount of hate propaganda directed against us, people would say, well, perhaps not. And then when they were told that a certain Mr. Griffin was in charge of the party, they pulled back even further. But when they were simply given the policies, they liked them. And the whole point is to preserve this tradition, because it means that we can speak from the heart without artifice, without having to construct some elaborate poll-driven like most professional politicians, we don't look at the polls and say, oh, I must say X because that's what people appear to be thinking. They have to change it next week. We can speak from the heart because we know actually that in doing so, we reflect the feelings of most people. But we have to accept that the BNP made serious mistakes, largely as a result of the leadership. And this is largely a matter of framing a constitution that prevents one person from having as much power. John Tyndall, the original designer of the BNP, did so for a very good reason. He made it an authoritarian party because he was reacting against the shambolic state of the leadership of the National Front, as he saw it, which was riven with factionalism. So he set out to make a party that wouldn't be riven by factionalism, but in doing so, he created a party which was completely top-down, authoritarian, do as you're told or you're booted out. Well, we can't afford that because far too many good people were kicked out of the BNP simply because their face didn't fit, simply because they had the temerity to challenge the leadership, or because they asked to see the accounts. So one of the things we've done is to make the treasurer completely independent of the chairman. The chairman looks after the accounts and will report them to the membership. They are transparent. The chairman, again, has no control over the judiciary because the chairman must not be allowed to simply sack people because they're personal enemies of his on trumped-up charges. So any case of reported misbehaviour would be tried by a panel chosen by lot from a panel which had been previously established long before the trial, if you see what I mean. So it could not possibly be chosen in order to be a hanging jury. These are the sorts of things which we've introduced. They're largely the work of Andrew Bronze and of Adrian Davies, a professional barrister. And the whole point is to design a better BNP which won't have the flaws of factionalism and of authoritarianism, so that we retain good people. We will tolerate a degree of disagreement because, for once, some sort of internal diversity would be valuable. We need to listen to different points of view, but we share a common objective. Now, if we can't do that within the party, we're certainly not going to get very far in dealing with people outside the party, however close they are to us. And we've set out from the start to try and work with other groups. We don't demand that everybody join us. We don't say, if you don't join us, you're not real nationalists. We say, we're all real nationalists. We may have different points of view, but as long as we work together, as long as we don't snipe at each other merely for the sake of scoring points, as long as we don't stand against each other saying, oh, well, if the such and such party is doing well in this ward, we'll parachute somebody in and steal some of their votes. No, that's not helping the cause at all. That's helping the mainstream parties. So the thing to do is, if necessary, if there's a better party than us in one part of the country, say the northwest or the northeast, we would work with them. We wouldn't demand that we merge. We wouldn't demand they come under our control or we come under theirs. We'd work as brothers towards a common goal.
Would that even extend?
Oh, in business.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on you there. Would that even extend to your members helping that particular that candidate there? So if they live within that jurisdiction, would you be okay with them sort of delivering leaflets and campaigning on behalf of that other nationalist?
If it was what I would call more responsible and respectable parties, why should we not? Because if we all want to get nationalists across the threshold, then that's necessary because we're not strong everywhere. We were originally a Northern and East Midlands party. We've had, thanks to the work of two really powerful activists who crossed over from the BNP, Mike Jones and Ken. We've had tremendous success in the Essex, Kent, Thames Estuary area, which we didn't previously. So our whole focus, our whole centre of gravity has shifted. But we still don't have many representatives in the rest of the country. That's a fact. So if another party were doing better in the West Midlands, and we had no candidates, and we thought they were going to do well, and we had members who were available to leaflet, it would be absolutely selfish to say, no, we're going to be dog in the manger about this. We're going to stand in their way just to score points off them. No, that would not be a serious political party's attitude. We would help them, and we would hope that they would help us if they had people available to help our candidates in the southeast increasingly. We would expect them to swallow their pride and say, yes, a fellow nationalist is worth supporting. We wouldn't necessarily have to have a formal deal to do that. To my mind, it would be an entirely informal thing, which would simply arise from nationalist natural feelings. I must support a fellow nationalist when I can.
Brilliant. I think that is just the kind of ethos that we need to have to succeed. You know, this egotistical, I am the man sort of thing needs to end. It really does. I mean, we've always had this position where it's actually in our founding principles where there is no leader. It's a leaderless organisation. We actually expect people to sort of lead themselves, you know, with regards to their activism and different campaigns and things. And we're very much of the same sort of thought. You know, if we can, why build something new when someone's already got 50% of the work already done? You know, if all they require is a bit of manpower to help push in the right direction, absolutely push with them. You know, so I applaud that 110%. I really do, Jim. That's really good.
We would welcome at any stage some sort of umbrella organisation bringing together all the different parties and movements and so on. Again, it wouldn't be led by a single individual. It would have to have some sort of consensual committee arrangement. And if people want to thrash out their differences, they can do so in a committee room and say, what is the best solution for nationalism as a whole? Yeah. But one has to be suspicious of people say, I don't want anything to do with other political parties. We're going to stand on our own. You assume it is simply the product of a narrow ego that says, I'm going to be the leader, the rest of you can be followers. There's got to be a reason for this, and it's not generally for the good of the people.
It's usually financial. If I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me on that one, won't you, James? Jim, sorry.
I'm not even going to comment on that. I don't wish to assign unworthy motives to people. I merely state that as a way of going forwards, it's useless and it has to stop. Yeah. I would like to hear why these people think that they are the sole bearers of the truth and that if everybody gets behind them, everything will be wonderful. If they've got any sense, they'll admit that they are at best partial bearers of the truth and have to work with the rest of us. Then we might trust them.
Yeah. Well, this is a game of hundreds of thousands, isn't it? It's not a game of hundreds. You know, if we are truly to succeed, we have to win the hearts and minds of the general population. You know, there's no change without that. You know, we must succeed on that front, and I agree with you. I think everything you said there is the pathway to making that happen. Fingers crossed. You know, we all can't read the future, but I think this is now in the political climate that we're in at the moment. I think we've probably got the best chance that we've had for a long time, especially with the vacuum that's going on right now with the Conservatives, with the Labour. You know, they can't even decide on a leader for themselves, let alone how to run the country.
They can't even decide what a woman is in some cases.
Yeah.
But we're a long way from being a mass movement. But what we must do for the future, immediate future, is build up an officer corps, a cadre of people who can lead branches. Don't have to be supervised. That's, again, one of the things we've learned from the BNP experience is trust local people. Mr. Griffin had an unpleasant habit of parachuting himself into local elections. I am the man, even when there were better qualified local candidates, even when local advice said, don't do this, do that. We would try to trust local people and say, if you're running the branch, you're the best qualified person to make decisions about what should be in the leaflet, what should be the policies, how to respond to local issues. They shouldn't be decided centrally by somebody that frankly doesn't know what he's talking about. So our emphasis is on decentralization, on empowering local officials to make decisions and basically giving them the resources to get on with the job. it's rather like military principle. I mean, the man on the spot knows best, not the man in the Admiralty or the man at General Headquarters. Trust the people, provide them with the resources to do the job, let them get on with it. If we can build a party that's got a mentality of letting the chap at the local level make the decisions, then we will succeed in building a mass movement. Lots of people left the BNP because they basically realized that nothing they did or said was ever going to have any impact on central thinking, that they might as well not be there. Nobody was listening to them. We must avoid that at all costs. We will become a mass movement when enough people trust the local leadership, the chap they know. They may not even be interested in who's the head of the party. That might be so distant. But if they know the chap that lives in their neighbourhood is entirely trustworthy and doing a good job, they're 10 times more likely to join, because they say, at least I know that my local branch will be run well. There will be no corruption. The chaps that are leading us will be the ones that we elect, and therefore we can have confidence in them. And then the party as a whole, if it's built up by good little bricks, as it were, it will reach to being an edifice. But we can't do too much from the top down by sort of directing people from on high. It's much better to build up local branches. And that's why, again, we must trust other parties and say if they're stronger in a different area, we must trust them to get on with it and help them as much as we can.
Totally agree. Oh, you've pretty much covered that was my first question, actually, was about the future of British politics, and I think we've kind of covered that quite well there, actually. Unless there's anything that you would like to add. I mean,
a vacuum waiting to be filled.
Yeah, and hopefully it doesn't get filled by someone even worse in the meantime.
Well, there are sort of weird environmental extremists who are waiting in the wings. The sort of factions that lie down in the road and get covered with glue and so on. We don't want a sort of gilet jaune type awkwardness for the sake of being awkward. We don't want that sort of holier than thou environmentalism to fill the gap. But it is out there waiting, and if enough people get frustrated and think they're the only people that I can vote for that are rocking the boat and challenging the establishment, there is the danger they will go down that path, mistaking it for a way forwards when actually it's just a way up a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'm terrified at the moment of is, this is my theory, so take it or leave it or whatever. But I've been anticipating a pressure valve party for a good while now, and with GB News sort of picking up steam, you've got Eamon Holmes, you've got Nigel Farage, you've got a few of the other guys that are getting quite they're starting to talk about things that were just not talked about maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago, and I'm just getting a bit concerned that they're going to start a political party, and because of their sort of mainstream exposure already, they would do very well. I'm just a bit concerned about that, really. I mean, maybe that's an extra question I could add to you. If that did happen, what would be your response?
Well, they already have a party waiting in the wings. Why do you think Richard Tice is on the TV so often? Not only on GB News, but on Talk TV, which again is coming up as a challenger to GB News. But again, relying very much on Vox Pop, on ringing. I managed to get in for sort of 2 minutes the other day on the Ian Collins hour. But again, I would welcome everybody watching this podcast to make the effort to get onto either GB News by sending an email to gbviews@GB News, or talking directly to the people on Talk TV, because I waited for about 15 minutes on the first day and was then promised that I would be on. It so happened that when they tried to contact me, I was driving. The next morning I rang again, and immediately a woman picked the phone up and said, "Hello, Jim from Bradford." They recognised my number and name immediately, because obviously it's stored on a computer. And I was on within 5 minutes onto the Ian Collins programme. I didn't get much of a segment, but the point is, if I can do that, everybody listening or watching can do that. And after all, they need to fill space. They need to fill time with views being sent to them. If you don't do it, then you're failing in your job as a nationalist, because other people, crazy people, will fill the space. But as for is there a party waiting in the wings? Yes, reform is being groomed to fill that space. But I have the greatest respect for people like Colin Brazier, Alastair Stewart, Mark Stein. I watch headliners religiously because those comedians include a couple of very good people, Leo Kearse and Nick Dixon, who's a fellow Cumbrian. They again are saying things that would be completely unsayable only a year or two ago. They're constantly going on about flows of migrants. They're constantly going on about grooming, just as the mainstream are trying desperately to avoid these issues. Now, the point is the public will vote with their feet or their ears or their eyes. Sooner or later, they will say mainstream is rubbish. They are systematically avoiding issues. The only thing that GB News and Talk TV fall down on is their coverage of the wider world. To know what's going on in Mali or Sri Lanka or Singapore, you have to watch Al Jazeera. Because again, British mainstream and even minority interest TV ignores the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is telling us things which may come home to roost in this country. In Sri Lanka recently, people stormed the presidential palace because they were so frustrated at the government. And the then Prime Minister, I believe, or possibly President, I'm slightly confused, Rajapaksa, fled to Singapore, presumably with a large bag of loot, one assumes, rather like his predecessor in Afghanistan, if you remember, did a runner with most of the national treasury in his bag. This sort of thing is not being reported in the mainstream media. One has to ask why. The answer is that one day these sorts of things are going to happen closer to home. They set a precedent which the establishment is looking at with horror and is basically saying we want it never to happen here. We don't want crowds storming 10 Downing Street and chasing the Prime Minister onto the nearest jet, and he then flies off to Switzerland with his loot. But one day it might happen here, and the establishment is trying to keep people from even being aware that that's what's going on in lots of the world.
Well, I think they need to start doing their job correctly, otherwise that's becoming a reality that could be true in the not so distant future, I think, if they continue to make the bad. And we were talking previously before, weren't we, about political parties changing their sort of talking points to fit the people, and that's exactly the problem that you have now with the Conservative government, where nothing that they ever say has anything to do with conserving anything socially, economically, in any way, shape or form. They are as bad, if not worse, than Labour, I think. And that just goes to show that, this country really does need a really good Conservative voice, to speak about these things in an open and honest way and have a really sensible conversation about these things.
You've had generational slippage. What we think of as common sense, people of my generation, is no longer common sense, because if you ask 20-year-olds, it's not their common sense. They're so habituated to a completely different way of thinking on things like gay rights and the rest of it. It is now the norm, not the exception. What was once beyond the pale is now inside the pale. We'll come to that when we talk about the sexualization of children and so on. But we can't refer to the idea of common sense anymore, because the whole point about diversity is, yes, we are a very diverse society, but it didn't have to be so. It's been made so deliberately. If you look at where the diversity posters are most frequent, they're in the waiting rooms of large corporations, usually run by foreign corporations like Americans or EU corporations. Why are they encouraging diversity and inclusivity and the rest of it? Because they want to break down nationalism. If the BDP has a core principle, it's the nation state. Our ideal type society is a nation state, not out of narrow chauvinism, but because a nation state is the best for its people. It provides the best standard of living and quality of living, because in a nation state, there is trust and confidence and a feeling that your neighbour is your friend and not your enemy. In multinational empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, your neighbour very often was not your friend. He might be some hostile tribe or sect or whatever who was probably lying awake at night hoping to cut your throat because you are to him an infidel or a race or nation of which he didn't approve, etc. We want to build a society which, as closely as possible, resembles a nation state because it's good for people. That's been proven by history. Nation states like Germany and Italy emerged because a nation existed and then formed a state. What is happening now is that people are saying, well, we have this state. So everybody we pour into it, from whatever corner of the world they come, becomes a citizen of that state and thereby a national. And then we can call them a Briton. So you get things in the Sun, for instance. I remember one headline saying, Britons of all colours. Well, to me, that was a complete nonsensical statement. How could Britons be of one colour? There's only one colour of Britain because Britons are of one lineage. What you're talking about is UK citizens of different colours. But the point is that we start from the principle of the ideal nation state, and everything which departs from that is essentially corroding it and destroying it. And that is what the corporations, the global capitalists have been up to. And it's not a coincidence that they're trying to break down society into its constituent parts, to atomize us, to alienate us from each other, because then we can't stick together in a sort of in trade unions or in any other form of solidarity and say, no, we're not going to work for you for these ridiculous wages. No, we want better pay and conditions. What they want is a lot of individuals who can't even trust their neighbours and therefore can't be form solidarity with their neighbours to challenge the dominance of global corporatism. And of course, the state, as in communism, is the biggest corporate institution of all. Yeah. And we saw that during COVID lockdown, where essentially it wasn't a nanny state, it was a wicked stepmother state. It went well beyond any sort of nannying. It was telling you you couldn't sit with more than X people in a park, or you couldn't see your dying relatives and all the rest of it. And people accepted it because they were still used to a certain extent of trusting that if the government said it was so, then it was indeed so. But how many people believe that anymore? The distrust is now massive, endemic, and perfectly reasonable because we know that the state is not doing what's in our interests, it's doing what's in the state's interest. And I think the whole COVID lockdown taught people who would previously have said, well, the authorities know best, or the authorities are doing this because it's in our interest, they're only looking after our good. They finally realised, it's taken long, but they finally realised that is not necessarily the case, that in fact the state is out to feather its own nest by reducing us to the status of serfs and slaves and peons. And if we let them get away with it, we only have ourselves to blame.
I would agree, yeah. I'd even take it one step further that, it's even looking after the state has kind of gone out the window now, isn't it? With all the COVID stuff that went on. I mean, even as a very sort of just to touch on one example, was the track and trace app that ended up costing nearly £100 billion of taxpayers' money. That Amazon had actually come to the government and various other governments and said to them, look, the way that our delivery network works and the way that we have our sat navs working to get our deliveries out to these, is essentially they could have just adapted their system for next to nothing, and Amazon were willing to give them this computer program to essentially, and they would have helped them adapt it, but the UK government actually rejected that. They accepted the offer to get the vaccines delivered and to have the distribution network logistics sorted for that and for distributing the masks and everything, but they actually rejected them on the track and trace, as far as I believe, which is, it's £100 billion sack of money for people to just dive into. And as far as I know, there were no leading British tech giants that were involved in that. These were all unknown guys, the same as Matt Hancock firing up and I want to be very careful here because I don't want to, drop myself in trouble and sort of accusing someone of something that they haven't done. But essentially, these PPE companies popped up out of nowhere that were in dormancy for like 5 years before, and then all of a sudden fired up and were involved in millions of pounds worth of PPE. And whether that was non-profit or not, come on, really? You don't do these sorts of big business deals with zero profit, do you? There was obviously something earned somewhere along the lines with these things, and I think just to earn money from a pandemic like that is absolutely atrocious and goes against every nationalist sort of feeling that I have towards these things. I was quite endeared at the start of COVID, because I believed it all at first, as I think most people did. I don't think anyone called it as BS from the get-go. But I felt the camaraderie at the through the first maybe month or so of it, where I felt like we were really in something big together, and this is actually, although it's a really bad scenario, isn't it great to see our entire country sort of coming together for the betterment of our people. I don't know what your feelings are on that, but obviously, the COVID wasn't as bad as everyone made it out to be. So. It was all...
Yes, we were being manipulated. The sort of Dunkirk spirit was being worked up. But first of all, anything to do with the government and big computer programs has always been a failure. The classic example was the NHS reorganisation under Blair, where they tried to get every computer in the NHS to speak to every other computer in the NHS. And every IT expert consulted said it cannot be done because it's just too complicated. There isn't a computer on earth that can cope with that sort of complexity. Well, I don't know how many billions they spent, but they found out that was in fact the case. They've now gone back to much more modest ambitions of getting some computers to speak to sort of central hubs and get them to speak to other central hubs and the rest of it. But I spoke to an IT expert the other day and said everybody in the trade knew it could not work. But you cannot tell the government anything. They just go out and spend more taxpayers' money because they can always raise more. We now have the spectacle of Rishi Sunak telling us that the number one problem is inflation. Why? Because so much money was printed during lockdown. Well, who printed it? I think it was a chap called Rishi Sunak,
yes,
aided by Andrew Bailey at the head of the Bank of England, that said he can do nothing to control it. Well, if he can't do anything to control it, maybe we better find a better head of the Bank of England. Yeah. But when you add that to all the numerous defence blunders that have gone on over the years, every major defence programme I can think of has run into the sands. It spent millions because of a very simple factor, which is the generals or the admirals or the air marshals keep adding bits on and saying, OK, we've got this super lightweight fighter. Let's put an even bigger, better radar set on it. And then let's put an even bigger, better, heavier afterburner on it. And eventually it ceases to be a light, maneuverable, all-purpose fighter. It becomes a great, big, clunking object which could barely stagger into the sky because they've put so many extras onto it. At which point they give up and say, OK, let's buy the American one since it's off the shelf and we can get it for half the price we've already spent anyway. And this happens with monotonous frequency.
Yeah.
They never learn. This is the thing you learn about governments, is they never learn from the last major, if I can use the expression, before 9 o'clock cock up. They never learn and say, we must change our way of thinking. We must do things differently. They go and make the same blunder again. The blunder in this case was to print money. But remember that all fiat currencies are basically Mickey Mouse money. They're not on the gold standard. The dollar in your pocket, the pound in your pocket, the franc in your pocket, the euro in your pocket nowadays, they're all just bits of paper which only have value as long as governments enforce their being value and say you must pay with this currency. But if the rest of the world decides that the pound sterling is worth absolutely nothing, then that unfortunately is going to be the economic disaster which is going to do for us all. Because at the end of the day, it's only kept airborne by willpower. It's got nothing behind it. Gordon Brown, if you remember, sold most of the gold in the Bank of England at the lowest possible rate. And we have nothing now to back up the pound sterling. As long as the GDP is sort of reasonably respectable, we will eventually pay it off, but only in generations' time. But every time we have a lockdown, we are less able to pay for the previous debt. And yet the debt will rise because the government insists on printing yet more money. The way out of this, as Liz Truss is saying, is not simply to crouch low and hope it will pass over and in the meantime print lots of money. She is quite right in saying that the only way to get anywhere is to grow the economy. But then, how are you going to do that if you're simultaneously trying to obey the climate lobby instructions, which are we to have zero growth? Are we going to have zero growth, or are we not going to have zero growth? If we're going to have zero growth, we satisfy the environmentalists, but we starve to death instead of freezing, or freeze to death instead of starving, but we come to a sticky end. If, on the other hand, we go for growth, then we cannot satisfy the climate goals we've been set, the net zero. So the politicians are clearly talking nonsense because they're trying to ride horses in two different directions at the same time. It only calls for the people to say, wait a minute, we're being conned here, to realise that the mainstream parties haven't got a clue.
Yeah, and another bit to sort of add on to that as well is, where you're saying about where they go, right, we need economic growth now. Rishi Sunak's idea was, well, I'll tell you what, we'll just hand out 50,000 quid to anybody who's willing to start a business. And it's like the fraud and corruption that came from that was just unreal. I mean, I know people personally that applied for these new business loans. And they literally spent the first couple of grand on kind of proving to start a business, and then the rest of it went on holidays going to Malaga after their second vaccines. I've never seen such an astronomical waste of money.
This has happened in Bradford at the local level going back decades.
Yeah.
There was a pot of money called Regen 2000. It was handed out to all sorts of dodgy characters who just turned up and said, I want to finance a new business. Please give me some money. And the lady in charge of that just handed the money out. There was a project called the Trident Project in a particular Labour ward, unsurprisingly started under a Labour council. It was basically money was handed out to, how can I put it, Friends of Labour. And the whole ward, money was showered over it. A local police force was set up, all sorts of things. But gosh darn, everything that's happening now on a national level is probably going on and has been going on at a local level, which is why it's important to get nationalist councillors in to keep an eye on the corruption and so on. We haven't come to grooming yet, but there was a widespread suspicion that at least 2 Labour councillors were groomers going back to the 2000s. So unsurprisingly, the Labour-run council was not terribly interested in looking into grooming. But these were widespread suspicions. And the whole point is that if there hadn't been nationalists to try and at least find out what was going on in the can of worms, then we would know even less about it now than we do know. But it's highly suspicious when councils resist investigations by third parties into what's happened in the past and what is going on now. You have to ask, why do they not welcome an investigation if they've got nothing to hide? And this is happening up and down the country. It's happening in Rotherham, it's happening in Burnley, it's happening in Oldham, it's happening in Bradford. Councils are resisting investigation. Why? Because they know they've got something to hide. And that's true at the financial level. You're talking about money being handed out to people. This happens all the time. Yeah. And the only way to control it is to get nationalist councillors in there involved and looking at what's going on and demanding transparency, challenging these things when they happen.
Yeah. Do you think there's any value in not usurping or whatever, but trying to sort of get involved with the Conservative Party and trying to have more of a positive push on it, or do you think that's just a dead horse that's just not worth putting time into now?
Well, the problem is this. A lot of Conservatives privately agree with us. When I was elected BNP councillor, I can't keep track of the number of Tory councillors said, look, old boy, we're right behind you, but we mustn't be seen to be in the same room at the same time. This happened regularly. It was, yeah, we know where you're coming from and we have similar feelings, but We've got the good sense to keep our mouths shut because we know our political careers would grind to a halt if we ever voiced them. So yes, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, we support you, but don't quote me on that. And that is the problem. The difference between us and the Conservatives is not that they are viscerally opposed to what we're doing. They're viscerally in favour of what we're doing, but they're too career-oriented in many cases to speak out. There are a few good exceptions. The MP for Keighley, for instance, is doing a great deal. Robbie Moore is doing a great deal about grooming. And there are other people who are making similar noises. But they're the exception, not the rule. And they're not anywhere in the hierarchy. You don't get anybody high up saying the right things because they're looking over their shoulders, knowing they're going to get slaughtered in the morning's papers if they say one word that appears to be coming towards us. And as long as the Tory party is characterised by this cowardice, I don't see there's a great deal of point in talking to the party as a party. That's not the same as saying that we shouldn't talk to individuals at local level and try and cooperate with them. If you do get a Robbie Moore who's your MP, you have to then ask, do we want to stand nationalist against him who will take some of his votes and result in a Labour candidate being elected who will then shut the whole thing down? Or is it not better to help Mr. Moore? You see what I mean? Yeah. We may face difficult choices in the future. There may be individuals that we would like to see re-elected as Conservatives because we know they might be able to help us achieve our goals. But the party, as you say, Conservative in name only, it's not conserving anything. If you can't even conserve the people in your country from being swamped by other people who don't share their values and their traditions and their customs, well, you're not a Conservative party. It's Conservative in name only. The only thing less Conservative, I think, is a Conservative party in Canada, the Liberals and so on, in Australia and Canada. The whole point is they're not Conservatives and they're not Liberals. They're authoritarian leftists. Yeah. How they've been able to get away with stealing a party's name, well, history will tell.
Direction of policies and those changing times, I guess.
Well, it's what I said earlier about institutional creep. The institutions are being burrowed into and mined away by people who no longer believe in them. But that's partly because of something that I heard on Mark's last night. I think it was on the Mark Stein show, something I've been saying for years, but is very true. These politicians don't see the country as primarily the people anymore. I can remember going back to the days of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair particularly, you got tired of hearing the economy needs more migrant workers coming in. The economy needs this. The economy needs us to do this. And you thought, wait a minute, what about the people's needs? What about the country's needs? Well, these apparently were secondary. As the speaker on Mark Stein last night said, it's the job of the economy to serve the people, not the job of the people to serve the economy. If we're serving the economy, we're serfs, we're slaves. That's a plantation economy run by the man in the big house saying you peasants will go out and plant more cotton. That's what we're basically saying about ourselves, if we accept the idea that we live in an economy which might need more manpower, whatever that manpower is. It can arrive from Timbuktu, it doesn't matter. It's just manpower. It's more people to work on the production lines for the benefit of the guy in the big house. Yeah. Well, that's not how most people see the country, the nation. We see it as the people first, and we have an economy. The economy is there to serve our needs. It doesn't have to be bigger than we need it to be. It doesn't need to be big for the sake of bigness, unless, of course, you're a greedy capitalist who just wants to see the cash register ringing constantly. But most of us want to have our needs and wants satisfied. We don't want an economy that's bigger than it has to be, but it needs to be big enough to provide for the elderly, and as we're going to talk about later, for war veterans and people, so they don't have to sleep rough. An economy which isn't capable of supporting elderly people in comfort and isn't capable of rewarding war veterans for their service, well, that's not an economy I want to be associated with, even if somebody's cash register is ringing up zillions. It's not going to the right people. So it's not the right sort of economy.
Yeah.
What we want is an economy that serves the country.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I've always been quite stern on this. That I think a lot of the way around this is sort of taking more of a Hungarian sort of approach, which obviously it's not a quick fix or an overnight fix. But yeah, I think you could supplement a lot of the needed workforce from the 4.5%, or is it 5%? Sorry, I was just being rude and checking this before I said it, but they think that we are at about 3.8% at the moment. So what's that? I don't know what that is in numbers, but I imagine it's about like 550,000 unemployed or something in the UK, something along those lines. You know, why isn't that untapped workforce being used? You know, why do we need to import people, go through all that trouble to import workers from other countries who don't really want to leave their own countries? They're only coming here because they can potentially earn a little bit more and have a better life in their own country once they've earned that money and take it home. You know, why aren't we encouraging good rates and good bonuses, or perhaps maybe put something into the policy of, look, if you're unemployed and you've been unemployed. This is just a bit of an idea off the top of my head, but you've been unemployed for the past 5 years. If you get into work and you stick at a stable job for the next year, then you get a bit of a bonus of some kind or another for actually sticking to that and to staying in a job. And then maybe once you've been there for 5 years, perhaps you could get given, if you were in council accommodation, maybe you could get given like 5% of the value of that house, so you actually own something within that property, and then on the side of that, then, encourage and incentivize indigenous birth rates. I don't see any of these options being out of the reach of possibility, really, and it just dissolves any need for any kind of permanent long-term immigration.
I agree with all your 3 points. One, as long as people say, "Oh, I'd rather just wait for the gyro check to land on my doormat with a dull thud," I'm not going out and picking peas in Lincolnshire or strawberries or whatever. Let them rot. Yeah. Well, at what point do you say, what makes you think that you're entitled to get money for doing nothing when food is rotting simply because nobody is willing to pick it? Yeah. I don't have any problems with directed labour. After X months on the dole, you're simply told there is a job picking peas in Lincolnshire. The peas are going to rot if nobody picks them. We're not going to import more people from the Balkans or, these days, Indonesia to pick them simply because you're too bone idle to get out of bed. If you expect to get another gyro check, you better show some signs of, it might not be picking peas in Lincolnshire, it might be clearing snow in winter, it might be picking litter up. But for heaven's sake, if you're fit and able-bodied, get up and do something. You can't just expect to spend your life in the pub fueled by the rest of us working hard.
Yeah.
2, you mentioned the whole business of housing. There's an excellent book written by a group of sociologists. I remember Jeff Deutsch, I think, was one of them, called The East End. It basically lamented the decline of the contributory principle to housing. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, within living memory, people got onto a housing ladder by contributing. They paid their taxes, they paid their NI, they waited patiently till a house became available. Then the system was changed so that contribution was no longer a valid point. It was need. And what Deutsch, I think it was, I hope he's got his name right, Jeff Deutsch, something like that. What he said was that suddenly when need became the criteria, and of course the freshly arrived immigrant on the Dover beach could trump everybody in Britain, because he could say, I've got nothing except the shirt on my back and this rubber dinghy, which I'm just going to deflate. I have a greater need than anybody, so I get the housing. And that's what happened. And these people have poured in and they've taken the housing. So the war veterans don't get it, and the people who've paid their taxes and are waiting patiently in the queue don't get it. Even when fresh housing is built, it's not enough. There's no indigenous growth rate. So where is the need for housing on the green belt? It's to house people who have no business being here in the first place because they've come in to fit jobs which should be filled by our own people, but our own people aren't being trained up for them. I'll give you an example. I used to guard as a security officer a well-known computer firm, and I was puzzled. This would be 20 years ago, that all the people working on the computer seemed to be Indians. And I was told, why is it we have so many Indians and so few British people? Oh, because the Indians are working for the rate that this company pays in India. Yes. And I said, good grief. You mean they're bringing them in because they're cheap labour and not hiring British people? Yes, of course. Why do you think? But wait a minute. How can these Indians survive if they're being paid Indian level wages? Then how can they survive in Britain? Because they'll starve to death. Oh no, as soon as they arrive, they're given a form to take to the Social Security office. The firm provides them with a form saying, I only earn X.
Low income.
And the taxpayer then makes that up to a living wage. So the less the company pays them, the more the taxpayer subsidises the company. Basically, the company is just taking the taxpayer for a ride, and the government is perfectly aware of this. It's letting them do that. As far as I know, that still goes on. But remember, there's a further angle to it. Training. You'd say, well, why don't they just train up British people to do it? Well, that costs the firm or the government or somebody money. So the whole point is to poach already trained graduates that have either paid for or been paid for so that they can work for you, and you don't pay for their training. You just pick the low-hanging fruit. You just pick the already trained graduates in India. They're willing to come because, as far as they're concerned, they're getting a promotion by coming to Britain. They're getting access to a higher standard of living. But, of course, the British worker waits in the back of the queue waiting to be hired. It's not going to happen. He's not going to be retrained. Remember that white working class people are the least likely people of all to go to university. A ward in Bradford, one of the wards in Bradford South, one of my area, Tong, has the lowest university application rate in the country. Now that has to change, but when 2 millionaires some time ago offered to help working class white boys and girls go to university, they were told this was illegal because it was discriminatory. Yet, programs exist to help black people and Asian people go to university because that's helping diversity and inclusivity and all the rest of it. But apparently, this doesn't apply if you're white and working class. You're right at the back of the queue. And this reflects something which is an attitude going right through both our political parties, which is essentially that the great unspoken word is classism. Class still counts for a lot in British society, and one thing in particular, I will never ever forgive Tony Crossland. Do people remember Tony Crossland? I'm afraid I'm going to swear on air, but he once said, I'm going to abolish every effing grammar school in this country, if I possibly can. I'm going to abolish every effing grammar school in this country. And of course he did that. Outside Kent, grammar schools are rare. They're not financed by local authority money anymore. I came from a grammar school background, from Bristol Grammar School. It got me to university. It got a lot of people to university. Is it a coincidence that so many of the recent leaders of the Labour Party are public school boys? One thinks of Tony Blair going to Feats. One thinks of Tony Crossland and other people. You've got a privileged elite who are very anxious to prevent other people from getting out of working class poverty and into middle class affluence. What is the word that the Labour Party is most afraid of? Embourgeoisement. Why? They might become little Thatcherites. Embourgeoisement. Becoming bourgeois. Becoming little Thatcherites, owning their own houses, running their own businesses, making their own decisions about how they spend the money in their pocket. No, the privileged elite that run the Labour Party these days, they don't want to be challenged by upwardly mobile grammar school boys, so they want to keep them going to mass sort of dormitory comprehensives. You know what I mean? Just education for the masses, worse than the old secondary moderns, because they want to keep the working class in permanent subjection. They're meant to be a docile, sheep-like mass who will be led by the privileged elite forever. This is the Tony Benns, remember, Viscount Stansgate, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, who becomes Tony Benn, your friend, with the cup of tea that he's made himself, etc., etc. This is a chummy face of a segment of the aristocracy who believe that they have a God-given right to lead the working class towards the promised land, towards the great socialist millennium. But like Lenin and so many others, they don't believe the working class are capable of doing it for themselves. They're too stupid. They have to be led by a better class of person. And that's why the Labour Party loathes and detests grammar schools, embourgeoisement, people buying their council houses and, starting to tend their own gardens and all the rest of it. It's the growth of the middle class that terrifies them, because what they want is a docile, sheep-like working class who will do as they're told. Now, what was the COVID lockdown except an attempt to force us all back into that sheep-like mass? Yeah. Yes, sir, you must do as you're told. You may not play in the park with your kids. You may not see your grandma. You've got to become a docile mass of obedient slaves. It's very much the Mussolini principle, credere, ubbidire, combattere, remember? Wow. Well, not the combattere, but the credere and the ubbidire. You've got to believe and you've got to obey. And I don't suppose that the COVID lockdowners would care to be reminded that they're enforcing Mussolinian principles, but that's what they are.
Yeah, agreed. And I saw this happening the whole way through with regards to kids in school. That I was kind of saying, well, they're not doing their work, they're not at school, they've been out for 2 years, their GCSEs are coming up soon. What's going to happen? And they did exactly what I thought they would, which is essentially just reduce the level of ability that you need to pass these tests, which is playing right into their hands with exactly what you're saying is, yeah, they've got their grades, but they haven't got the intelligence to back those grades up. So what you're actually ending up with is sort of an empty balloon, sort of moving forward, and that's not to say that these kids aren't intelligent and haven't done well with what they had, but it's an attack, isn't it? They are trying to bring in sort of not a dumb generation. That's a bit too harsh, really.
The dumbing down has been going on for years. When I was last a university lecturer, before I was sort of blacklisted as politically incorrect, not allowed to take it any further. When I was a university lecturer, I was at the University of Sheffield, and I was repeatedly picking up on essays, even in final year students who couldn't spell two-syllable words. I mean, I'm talking about energy, spelled E-N-J-Y.
Right.
Coming, spelled C-U-M-M-I-N-G, and so on. I would sort of cross these out and put the correct spelling in and report them for things like mistakes in grammar. I was told off and told you must not interfere with the student's way of writing. You must not correct spelling, pronunciation, grammar. And I said, well, do you want people with University of Sheffield degrees going around who can't spell basic English?
Wow.
It's none of your business. Your job is to get all these people passed, get them as graduates. A friend of mine, it was even worse, he refused to pass some Chinese graduate PhDs because he noticed that they're all plagiarized. He was told you will pass them or you will lose your job. So he handed his job in. He later on became a very successful consultant. But this was going on 20 and 30 years ago. I was last a lecturer, which it'd be more like 40 years ago. And this was common practice. It was bums on seats. Yeah. It was, yes, we'll take Chinese or Saudi or whatever money. Yes, we will dumb down our students so they're incapable of writing the Queen's English. They won't know how to spell things. They won't punctuate. They won't understand any grammar more complicated than subject, verb, object. They won't be able to cope with concessionary clauses. But you've got to ask yourselves, again, it's the Tony Crosland principle. Let's keep these working class people stupid. Because if they can't even write well, they're not going to challenge our position at the top, are they? They're never going to become MPs. They're never going to become major figures in the civil service or anything else. Yeah. You've got to ask yourself, for whose benefit? The old argument, cui bono. Who is profiting from this dumbing down of our people? Well, immigrants are benefiting because they drive their children to work. They make sure, they say, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to become a pharmacist, you're going to study hard. No, you're not going out playing with your white friends. You're stopping in and doing your homework.
Yeah.
They benefit because they have a hard driving work ethos.
Yeah.
Ours, we tolerate the fact that their dads will say, yes, let's go down the pub, or here, have another 2-litre bottled cider, or whatever. It doesn't matter because it's only your education. You're only going to become a common labourer like me. Don't aspire to anything more than that, etc., etc. We're assisting in the dumbing down of our people. Other people are benefiting. It's the established elites and the immigrant, upwardly mobile elites of the future who are benefiting, and we are letting our children down. I'm talking about people on the housing estates who are not encouraged to aspire to anything greater. I can think of one of the biggest estates in South Bradford. The lady that was the constant councillor for it lived in a leafy suburb, well out of range of the council estates, in a mansion, in a leafy lane, in a well-off part of Bradford. Nobody ever asked how she and her husband, who between them were both councillors and got £142,000 from various quangos and other organisations, could said to be representative of the working class people on their estates, who of course were scrabbling around trying to get any sort of work or living third generation on the dole, rather like Shameless, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There was no correlation between the one and the other. And I never saw any sign that she encouraged her people, the people who went out like sheep and voted for her, to be upwardly mobile.
Yeah.
Why? It wasn't in her interest. She got a job for life by keeping them stupid and docile, and not in employment, and constantly coming to her begging for charity, essentially. Her job was to be Lady Bountiful and hand out charity. Oh, I can fix you a council house. Yes, I can get something done about that awful indoor plumbing. She was the Lady Bountiful forever, as long as they stayed willing to be recipients of her favours. As long as they voted her in, well, she got a job for life.
Yeah.
Now, this is the sort of characteristic that we nationalists have got to challenge. We've got to say, we're going to go out on those estates and get those people to have higher ambitions, and we're going to help them get out of those estates and do well for themselves. But the Labour Party is never going to do that because it's not the Labour Party's interests.
Yeah.
All they generate is hot air rhetoric. And to be fair, a lot of the Conservative rhetoric about levelling up is not much better. Where is the levelling up?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, even if you go back to sort of the mining towns and the sort of the ethos around that, you know, where you would have, you know, it was very rare that someone would break out of a mining town until it had actually been completely stopped by Thatcher. I believe she shut down most of the mines, didn't she?
She shut down a lot of things which should never have been shut down, which should have been improved. Investment should have been made.
Yeah.
A lot of them were clapped out. But look, we've now got a situation where Drax Power Station is not only polluting far more than they will admit, but it's run on wood chips imported from Canada at vast expense when it's sitting on the biggest coal mine in Britain, which isn't being exploited because the environmental fanatics, the followers of Greta Thunberg and the rest of them, have convinced us that the polar bears will all die or the trees have to be hugged or whatever. But if we just simply thought, what's in it for Britain, the logical thing is to mine our coal, like the coalfield which could be opened up in Cumberland, like the oil and gas in the North Sea. There's a field off Scotland, Canberra or something, waiting to be exploited, waiting for some bureaucrat to tick the right boxes. We have the resources to avoid energy indebtedness. We don't have to import everything from Putin or anybody else. We are sitting on massive resources. We've shut down the storage capacity. France and Germany have 25% storage capacity. Our brilliant government shut it down to about 2%. So that if there is a hiccup in the supply, we're in real trouble because we can't store things from one peak to another through the troughs. Well, how clever was that? But that's just typical of our government's inability to see ahead. Again, going back to universities, Tony Blair decreed that 50% of people should go to universities. Why? 50% of jobs didn't suddenly become graduate jobs. Masses of managerial jobs didn't suddenly appear that required graduates. What it means is you've got lots of graduates with McBurger's jobs, with sweeping the floors in the offices with a degree. Once you've got a degree, people are unwilling to do manual work.
Yeah.
So that's not very clever.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we were importing plumbers and electricians and shop fitters from Poland and Latvia and so on. I have nothing against Poles and Latvians, don't get me wrong. But why weren't we training our own people to do that? Because Tony Blair and other people had this idea that somehow a university degree in some Mickey Mouse subject, media studies or something,
Yes.
was superior to a practical qualification in something that was actually of use, like plumbing or electrician jobs or plastering or anything, or even bricklayers at the moment are hard to find.
Yeah, they are.
But yet,
they are.
If you look at the actual earnings of people in employment in jobs like that, they are very good compared with the bottom rung of middle-class graduate employment, which is often very, very poorly paid because there's so many people available. You've basically flooded the market. It's all about supply and demand. The supply of plumbers is minimal, so they get good wages. The supply of media specialists and so on is massive. It exceeds the jobs available. Therefore, they can only ask for a very low wage.
Yeah.
Who does that suit? Well, not them and not the housing estates they come from. It suits the big corporations who now have dozens of applicants for every job and can therefore pay as little as they want.
Yeah.
Again, you have to sit back and ask, is this economy being run for the benefit of the people? No, it's being run for the benefit of big corporations and the governing elite, who are doing very nicely, thank you.
We need to start learning to love our own a little bit more, don't we, Jim? It really is the crux of it, isn't it? And start looking a bit more inward rather than outward.
Well, as long as we carry on subsidising countries in the world which have their own space programs and we don't have ours, who is responsible for this farce whereby we are sending money not only to corrupt regimes? I mean, the money which was sent to Swaziland, it's no longer called Swaziland, I forget what it's called now, but half of it went on the King's private jet that year. We're not helping the needy. There was an old statement, which is still true, which is foreign aid is about poor people in rich countries giving money to rich people in poor countries. How much of this money ever gets beyond the sticky fingers of the local elite? It doesn't. These countries are systematically corrupt. Any money given to them will go to the already rich elite, the people who profited from Western education and hold all the key jobs and come from, remember, the right tribe.
Yeah, I mean,
these societies are very often more inegalitarian in terms of your place in life is determined by what tribe you were born into, but it's not polite to point out the obvious that where there's a white tribe involved, like South Africa, that's the ultimate wickedness. But if it's another black tribe, that's all right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just sort of draws a comparison to the water aid and live aid, doesn't it, in Africa? I mean, it's not to knock anyone, but I mean, I've read somewhere that the attempt to develop Africa and turn it into a sort of a working nation or continent, I guess it is. It's the single biggest financial endeavour on Earth, as far as I know. So all the space programs, everything, all put together, everything that we've attempted to do as human beings, we've spent more on trying to fix Africa than we have anything else, and we've not got anywhere near any sort of success with that. It's the adverts are still, I don't watch TV, but I assume that they're still going. The water aid adverts and that sort of stuff. It's I totally agree. I think there just comes a point where you have to say, look, we're suffering ourselves now. We have to be in a position to be able to help ourselves before we can help anyone else. And that in my mind is when we've got every single veteran off the streets into reasonable accommodation with 3 meals in their belly every day. You know, if they are struggling with drugs or alcohol, then we should have systems and services in place for these people to help them, because they helped us. They put their lives on the line for us. They gave up years of their lives for us. You know, and we can't find just that little bit of compassion to be able to look after them in their later years when they're struggling. I just find it absolutely just unbelievable. I really do.
Some countries, Joe, I believe, have a minister for veterans. I don't know if there's one in the States or Canada, but I believe there's something resembling that. Why we don't have somewhere in the Defence Ministry a minister for veterans whose sole job, the whole point about this is they fall between so many stools that they're sleeping rough. The police try to move them on, but the police will be sympathetic, but they say, look, mate, you can't stay there. The housing people say, oh, well, they're not on the housing list because they haven't got a fixed abode to begin with, etc., etc., etc. They fall between so many stools because there's no specific responsibility for them. But they need counselling and everything else. And the only thing that can do is to set up a separate department, a veterans department. If we can have departments in local councils whose sole responsibility is to organise ethnic festivals, surely we can have one to organise veterans relief. I know which most people would rather pay for, but we have departments nationally for. Look at this business about the number of people being paid £70,000 odd jobs for diversity and inclusivity, which actually are occurring in departments which have already more than the national norm of ethnic membership already. Yeah. And of course, we've got the scandal in the RAF. Don't hire any more white men. Yeah. Not competence, not can they fly a plane or fix a plane. Are they the right shade of brown to be accepted this year? And the reason is because they're setting quotas which are never going to be fulfilled, because there's a very simple factor. If ethnic minorities have a preference for a certain sort of job, e.g. running a corner store or being a footballer or whatever, if they have any preference whatsoever, there won't be enough of them to fill the quotas in other sectors, because it's got to add up to 100%. So if large numbers of a particular ethnic minority say, well, I'll go into my father's shopping business or restaurant business or taxi business, then automatically there aren't enough of them to fill their quotas in the NHS or the army or anything else, even if they were interested in going in the army. But remember, these people arrive with cultural baggage. If in their home country, policemen are the lowest of the low, e.g., in the Indian subcontinent, a policeman is somebody who has to extract bribes because his wages are so low. It's assumed all policemen are going to stop you if they possibly can and say that your wheels are faulty so they can extract a bribe to let you move down 10 miles down the road till the next policeman does the same thing because his wages are low too. Result, policemen are looked down on. You only become a policeman if you're the lowest of the low. Now, why do they think that when they move to Britain, they're suddenly going to think the police force? That's a career I could look forward to. I want my son to be a policeman, not a doctor or a lawyer or a pharmacologist or whatever. I wanted to be a policeman because that's a really sound job. Well, that's not what they're going to think. And they're going to think the same as soldiers. If in their country, soldiers are brutal vermin who beat people up at roadblocks and assault women and all the rest of it. They're not going to volunteer in droves. They're not going to say, oh, but this is Britain and the armed forces are perhaps different. They're going to say, back home in Zimbabwe, the police were the people that beat me up. The soldiers were the people that beat me up. No, I don't want anything to do with men in uniform. They're scum. Well, that's what you're living with, is that the ethnic minorities you're trying to encourage to join particular professions come arriving with cultural baggage. They perceive other professions as being the ones they want to go into. And if they choose to do that, then you can't force them to join the professions that are underrepresented. Absolutely. It's just lunacy to even say we're going to determine that every profession in this country is going to be an exact replica of the national ratio of minorities to the majority population. It's not going to happen. You're trying to freeze society into an artificial framework of your creation. Societies don't behave like that. Diverse societies, least of all, because ethnic groups have their own preferences.
Yeah, and it's super racist. It's really racist to behave like that. You are literally becoming the thing that you accuse us of.
But then that gives you the clue that they're not really worried about racism in the first place, or it would have occurred to them that that is in fact the case. They're concerned about something else. They're concerned about power and hierarchy. Remember, these people are Marxists. So for them, everything is seen through one prism, which is the oppressor and the oppressed. Everything is a dyad of those who are in charge and those who are at the bottom. Now, in a sense, I've committed that by pointing out that's the way the Labour Party works and treats people on working estates. Well, it's not surprising because they're Marxists. Yeah. But what they're doing is carrying out their own perception of the world, which is everything is divided into them above and them below. There's nothing in between. That's why they can't stand on bourgeoisement, because there isn't a middle in Marxism. There's only an oppressor and oppressed. There isn't a getting by quite nicely in my little semi-detached with a well-cultivated garden and a medium-sized car. That doesn't exist in Marxism. There's no middle ground. There's only oppressors and oppressed. So everything's got to be seen through that prism. The sexes, for instance. Well, one of them's got to be, the yang and one the yin. One's got to be the oppressor. Okay, men are oppressors. Women are therefore the oppressed. Yeah. Even if it's a rich woman and a poor guy, somehow he's got to be the oppressor and she's got to be oppressed, because once you've set these things in concrete, that's the way they are. And the same with everything. It's got to be seen through the prism of. So when it became gays versus straights, well, the gays are the oppressed, even if they're rich multimillionaires with private islands, you know what I mean? And the straights are the oppressors, even if they're your veteran on the streets. Everything's got to be seen through a very simple prism of one category is all oppressors and one is all oppressed. There's no subtlety about this. There's no, well, some of them might be oppressors and some of them might not. Everything's got to be fitted into a framework of power, and everything is about controlling power in Marxist eyes, which is why they got it wrong in many cases. They couldn't understand in Poland why working class Catholics managed to overcome being forced into being the proletariat, the toiling masses. They didn't see themselves as the toiling masses, as the proletariat. They saw themselves as Poles, not Russians. They saw themselves as Catholics, not atheists. And they saw themselves as loyal members of a country rather than as people who took their orders from Moscow. So the experiment in Poland failed, and you had the Gdansk business and Lech Wałęsa and the rest of it, because Marxists don't understand human nature. They project their vision of how it should be onto how people are and get it wrong. And as in the case of Mao, 60 million people starved to death in the Great Leap Forward, because he says we're all going to become an industrial society overnight, and it didn't work. And as a result, they didn't grow enough rice and people died in their millions. But that's what happens when you get people with a fixed vision imposing their vision on humanity. And that's what happened during lockdown at a smaller scale. Is basically we had people in charge who wanted to impose their view of what was right and what was wrong on us. And if we rebelled, well, you have to go to prison or you have to be fined. Unless, of course, you're a member of the elite yourself, where you don't have to go to prison and you're not fined because it's all right if you're the right sort of person.
Yeah. Yeah, it also rings of the white privilege thing as well, doesn't it? And I often joke about this at work, when my eyes are caked completely with filler dust, and I can't see anymore, and I'm sort of like, I could really do with a bit of this white privilege now, do you know what I mean? It's
like all those war veterans. They're very privileged white people because they can sleep on the streets.
Yeah. Yeah, do you know? It really is absolutely... I'm so glad that you reminded me to silence my phone off, Jim. I really am. Honestly, I've had like 3 phone calls in the past 5 minutes. I'm so pleased that you remind me about that. That's brilliant. Whenever you're ready, Jim.
it to death now you've got the material. I was just going to say, at some stage, when we get onto families, as far as I'm concerned, the key point is that Trotsky and all of Marxists set out to destroy the family. They saw that if they destroyed the family and took over the family by the state, they'd achieve success. Because it's in the family you learn things which set you up for life. I had a very happy childhood. A lot of people these days don't because of divorce and all the rest of it. But the point is that the one thing you must prevent is that the state takes the child's mind over. It's the old Jesuit principle. Give us a child at 7 and we'll make you a man. Because what they mean is, very simply, mould them. It's no surprise that totalitarian societies start off with, the young pioneers and then Komsomol or the Hitler, the Hitler Youth or the Deutsche Jungvolk or whatever. Get them young, program them. They will never deviate from what's implanted in their minds. And that is what they're trying to do with all this sex conditioning and the rest of it. The whole thing is to take the children away from the parents. In a sense, the children are getting away from the parents anyway. When you've got massive rates of divorce and remarriage and cohabitation without marriage, everybody knows that relationships which are not based on marriage will split up much more readily than proper. I mean, the whole point of the marriage is to say to your neighbours that we are married, to make it more difficult for you to just walk away and leave your children to starve or leave your wife to starve. It's to make a public ceremony so that you can't welsh on the contract. You can't back out of it and say, I'm not responsible for this wife, I'm not responsible for these children. That's another point that we didn't mention is, look how capitalism has subtly got everybody to work for a living, whereas in the past, when I was a very young kid, there was a thing called a working man's wage. It wasn't just meant to support the person that did the work, it was meant to support him and his wife and his family. A man on a proper working man's wage didn't have to send his wife out to work. I can remember when it was assigned a badge of shame if your wife had to go out to work because you didn't bring home the money to support the family. You got a better job where you could say, my wife doesn't have to go out to work anymore. Doesn't have to go out to work anymore. Then, of course, the feminists come along and say, oh, but she should want to go out to work. Well, what this means is, if you stand back and look at it, that the capitalists have got a system whereby nowadays the man doesn't get enough to support the whole family so that the wife can devote her whole time to making sure he gets square meals. Instead of which, the odds are that probably the whole family now lives on chips or takeaways or junk food of some sort or other, at best a ready-to-cook meal. They've lost the time to cook a good, healthy meal from scratch, from basic vegetables and whatever, because there isn't the time to do so. Why? Because they're both running around like hamsters in a treadmill. Well, who created that system? The capitalists. They've now got 2 people working where previously they had 1. Women have not been liberated from housework. The housework still has to be done, and usually it's the woman that does it. What has happened is that women have simply been turned into domestics for capitalism. If you stand back and ask, well, who's doing the cleaning? Who's doing the catering in this firm I guard or work for or whatever? Well, it's usually women. Wait a minute. They would normally have been at home, cooking and cleaning in their own home, making sure their husbands and children were well fed on non-junk food, on healthy food, making sure the house was clean. Instead of which, they're now working all day long for some big firm. I worked alongside a girl, she worked as a receptionist. This is 30 or 40 years ago when I started in security. And she was constantly on the phone ringing home. And I said, who are you ringing? Oh, it's the childminder. I've got 2 young children at home. I said, wow, why are you ringing? Well, because she's an idiot. And whenever I ask, what are you giving them for lunch? She always gives them the same meal for lunch, fish fingers, chips and peas. It doesn't vary because it's all she knows how to cook. And I said, well, would it be better if you went home and looked after them? I mean, how much does this childminder cost you? Well, she costs me all my wages. I don't have anything left over. By the time I've paid the childminder for my wages, there's nothing left over. I've paid the bus fare. Well, in that case, wouldn't it be more logical for you to stop at home and look after your kids like an old-fashioned mother and housewife? Oh no, I've missed being in the office. And it's like, what, being ordered around by the person directly above you who's an absolute cow, which she was. Basically, just being a wage slave is better than being in your own house with your own children. I don't think so. It's probably a result of mass conditioning. I feel that if I don't go out and work, I've somehow failed. I'm just a housewife, just a mother.
I'm worthless if I'm not out working, or I'm less than a man because I'm not working. You know, missing this fact that at the end of the day, the only thing that's happened here is the tax man's getting 2 lots of tax coming in every week. You know, I mean, it was the same sort of thing that happened. My marriage failed under the same sort of circumstances, where it worked out that my wife was quite well paid, so she sort of immediately went back to work as soon as she could, which was against my wishes. I would have liked her to have stayed at home and raised our child, but with the wages that I was on, it would have only just about been, I mean, if anything would have happened drastic in that time, you know, we would have been in really serious trouble, even to the case of if she, while she was at work, if I was then to go out to work, which I did do 3 days a week, the trouble was, because I was searching for a job that would essentially that would work with our times, you know, with the 2 days a week that B would have gone into nursery, so I worked the other 3 days to try and find a job that fits within those 3 days that you're off. And it was a minimum wage job, so it didn't even cover the cost of the childcare that we were paying for me to go to work. We were actually at a loss.
Everybody knows that childcare in Britain is just a huge landmine waiting to explode, because it's almost unaffordable. But again, you've got the issue here, which again is not addressed by the mainstream parties, of associative mating. Basically, rich people marry, or well-off people, professional people marry other well-off professional people. Poor people tend to marry poor people because they're the people they're surrounded by and are most likely to run into. It's not often that rich people marry poor people or vice versa, because they move in different circles. They live in different neighbourhoods. They go to different pubs. They have different entertainments of all sorts. Result, you've got one lot of people with 4 cars in the drive, you know, mum, dad and the 2 kids. 4 cars in the drive crowding the motorways, and one that can barely afford the bus fare to work, because you've got 2 populations growing apart. The whole point about women should go out to work, so to speak, what it boils down to is it makes a great deal of difference whether she's working as a doctor and he's working as a lawyer. They bring home 2 enormous salaries, go out and look for a house. The mere fact they can afford a massive house means that house prices go up, because basically house prices go up to the level of the people, of what the people can afford to pay for them. Meanwhile, at the other end of the scale, 2 people who can barely subsist on the wages they've got as cleaners and cooks and security guards and everything else, low-skilled production workers, they can barely afford to rent a house, let alone ever dream of having a mortgage and a house of their own. And if they can manage it, they get buses to work, except, of course, when there's no buses running because they're working antisocial hours and they have to shell out for a taxi, which they can ill afford because a shift begins when there are no buses running, etc. But, I mean, again, associative mating, when you combine that with the sort of Marxist-imposed anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-ableism, anti-whateverism, it results in total nonsenses, whereby you're sitting by and watching as society slowly tears itself apart into separate, not speaking to each other atoms, you know, sectors that no longer even comprehend each other's existence. And this is partly being helped by best of intentions, road to hell is paved with, best of intentions, let's combat sexism, let's combat ableism, let's combat ageism. But the results very often the opposite of what people wanted. Instead of bringing society together and making us collectively better off. They're tearing us apart and reducing us to non-speaking sectors who simply have no conception of each other's existence. But as I say, and again, things like sending everybody to university, again, is you can see the logic behind it, perhaps the good intentions, but the results are disastrous. And that's, again, because we're just not thinking in terms of common sense and practicalities. We're allowing the theoreticians to dominate our lives.
Letting emotion get ahead of things as well, isn't it? This emotive state that we're in is truly terrifying, you know, and you do see it a lot with these with a lot of the people that we protest against with this drag queen stuff. You know, the mind boggles when you talk to these people, you know, because it is so far from logical reasoning. And, you know, we know we're not bad people. You know, we know that we just have children's best interests at heart, and that this is so obvious to the masses. But then you get this emotional attachment, which is, you know, off the back of the, you know, off the pain and suffering of you know, of the gay sort of community or whatever over the past, and then, you know, and then that's you know, obfuscated.
And trans people. I don't know if you saw a program the other night. Brian Linehan, who has been ostracised. I think he's a scriptwriter for Father Ted and things like that. I may have confused him with somebody else. Correct me if I'm wrong. But he's been ostracised. He was subjected to a vicious interview by Sarah Smith on Newsnight. And I know Newsnight has form because they did a program on me years ago, and it was pretty biased. But the point is that he is sticking up for the rights of people not to go through the transgender transformation. And he's pointing out that the States is usually 5 years ahead of us in most things. So they've gone through the epidemic of kids at age, you know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, suddenly announcing that they're boys trapped in girls' bodies or girls trapped in boys' bodies. Instead of being told, oh, don't worry, you're just a tomboy, you'll grow out of it, they're being taken to a gender reassignment clinic and operated on and being given puberty blockers and all the rest of it, which are irreversible. What's happening is now you're getting the buyer's regret. You're getting a whole mass of people who've had the surgery and the puberty blocking and the rest of it, and now suddenly realise it was a hideous mistake. The Tavistock Clinic has been shut down because they were more or less coercing people into doing these transformations. Again, you asked the principal, is there a financial interest? Of course there was. Every time that these people had an operation, somebody got some money for it. But it's also that we're surrendering to ideologues who are taking over children's lives from their parents. But the consequences of what we're doing now will be felt in 5 years' time, when you get a generation of people saying, we wish we hadn't had gender reassignment surgery, we wish we hadn't had for instance, the girls' breasts are being chopped off. They can't be sort of like stitched back on again when they realise that actually they were just going through a phase, an adolescent phase. We used to be capable of coping with adolescence and saying, don't worry, you'll grow out of it. Nowadays, it's straight down to the specialist, the shrink, who says, oh, yes, a clear case of body dysmorphia or something, we must operate immediately. They have a vested interest in saying that. That's what their careers are built on. But parents in the past would just have said, I don't believe a word you're saying. You're just a trick cyclist. I trust my own judgment and those of my parents and friends and neighbours. You know, common sense will prevail. It doesn't happen anymore because people are terrified of the specialist. He must be right. But as we saw in lockdown, the specialists were wrong and they disagreed among themselves. You had the Neil Fergusons predicting that we're on the verge of the Black Death and, you know, X million people were about to snuff it. Proved totally wrong. But people still believe that a man in a white coat knew best. Well, we all know that's what TV adverts are made of. A man puts on a white coat and says that Brand X toothpaste is now going to clean whiter than white. Because he's got a white coat on, some mug believes him. But we grew out of that years ago. And yet, when it happened during lockdown, people still believe that the people were telling the truth, even when it was later revealed that they had shares in drugs companies. So they would, wouldn't they? Etc., etc. But watching what's happening to children is particularly worrying when you realize that the Americans have gone through this experience. So why aren't we learning from them? They're like a telescope that looks into the future and tells you what the universe will look like 5 years in the future. It's like, the Hubble or the latest one, the James Webb or whatever, except it's looking forwards rather than backwards. We can learn from American experiences and not do it again. It's like euthanasia. There's now horrific stories coming out of Belgium and Holland and places where it's been legalized of people basically being, put to death by their relatives and so on. Why do we have to have an argument based on no evidence when the evidence is out there that these things can have consequences? Why do we have to relive somebody else's bad experience because we're too stupid to tune in to what's happening in the experiment? It's like in Colorado where they've legalized cannabis and they've now got a horrific epidemic of cannabis addiction and all sorts of consequences. When the people were told, oh, well, if we legalize cannabis, the gangsters will no longer have control of it. The gangsters are still doing very well, thank you very much, because there's still a market for illegal drugs. Just when you legalize them, you don't get a cessation of illegal trade. If that were the case, you wouldn't have contraband cigarettes when they're freely available. Yes, but you can get the contraband ones for less, and you can get them in different locations, and so on and so forth. All these experiments should be relevant to discussions in the present day because they offer us an opportunity to see how people have already carried out that experiment and it's failed. So we don't have to argue it on the basis of theory. We can argue it on the basis of fact.
Or at least have a well-educated guess.
Yeah.
Rather than just pointing in the complete opposite direction.
Yeah. Which so many of the arguments now are.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking what we've sort of covered and what we haven't now, James.
Crime and law and order is a big one. Look at the latest killings in London and so on and so forth. Law and order is collapsing in this country because the police are no longer on the streets. Robert Peel said the job of the police was to prevent crime. Prevent crime. That's not done by retreating into a fortress, as they have done in Bradford. I mean, the police have now retreated into this ziggurat-like fortress in Nelson Street. There used to be police stations all over Bradford. There aren't anymore. There's just a building which is clearly designed to hold out in the event of another riot, like the ones we had in 1995 and 2001. It's so that police can cower inside a fortress while the rest of us fend for ourselves. You don't have to be a genius to see it's designed to withstand a siege. It's designed for the protection of the police, not for the protection of the general public. Now, Robert Peel wanted the police out there preventing crime, not responding to crime, not reacting to crime. This was said very well by a retired policeman on GB News the other day. I forget his name, but he's a regular contributor. He said what we've got now is reactive policing. A crime occurs, a policeman comes along and gives you a crime number. A policeman comes across and dusts it down for fingerprints. A policeman comes across eventually and says, sorry, we're not investigating burglaries this week. We're too busy coping with anti-transgender tweets. So, I'm afraid the burglaries have to go to the back burner, etc., etc. But the Robert Peelian policeman was a member of the neighbourhood. He patrolled the streets. He was in contact with people. If you had your suspicions about dodgy people, you went up and talked to him. He'd say, oh, yes, that family. No, we've got our eyes on them. We know what they're up to. Don't worry. I mean, when I was a security officer in Keighley Youth Court, everybody knew that half the crimes in Keighley were committed by one family. No names, no pack drill. But dense clusters of crimes were associated with individual families in specific streets and specific neighbourhoods. Every policeman, every citizen in Keighley knew that, but there was no mechanism for sort of translating that into action. It still meant that the police had to pretend that they didn't know who the criminals were, and that when they were defended in court, everybody had to go through an elaborate farce of listening to a particular lawyer give a standard speech, which said, this criminal, Your Honour, is not a bad lad. He's fallen into bad company. He's had a hard upbringing. All criminals always have hard upbringings in court. He had a hard life. His mother didn't love him. His father was a violent alcoholic. He's fallen into bad company, but he's turned the corner, Your Worships. He's seen the light. He's turned over a new leaf. His girlfriend is pregnant. All girlfriends are always pregnant. You can't send him to prison, Your Honour, Your Worships, while his girlfriend's pregnant, because who's going to look after the kid? He's got a job. People in court always get jobs. They'll only last 24 hours, because as soon as the court case is over and he walks out smirking, having been found not guilty or conditional discharge, he's going to kick the job into touch because it's only there for show, etc., etc. I used to listen to this day in, day out and realise the whole thing was a farce. When once we had a totally innocent couple who hadn't been able to pay their community charge because the council had unilaterally suddenly doubled it and sent them a note saying, pay this or you're going to be taken to court. And they genuinely had got no money to pay this with, and because it had come out of the blue and they'd not calculated for it, they went round desperately trying to find a lawyer to defend them, and all the lawyers turned them down, said, sorry, we can't claim legal aid for this and you can't afford to pay us, so tough. And they went down. And everybody in court felt sorry for them. Meanwhile, the professional criminals, I'll give you an example of how professional criminals work. The same lawyer gave the usual speech, came up to some criminals who'd already been signed in by me as the security guard for the court that day. They'd already been signed in. They were on a charge of holding up a grocer's store or something. He hissed in their ears, do a runner. It's the stipon. It's the stipendiary magistrate. He will definitely find you guilty and send you down. Do a runner. You'll get picked up by the police in the morning and brought in, but by then it'll be the little old ladies again, and I'll do the usual soft sob act about you had a rough childhood and your mother didn't love you and you've got a pregnant girlfriend. Don't worry, you'll get a conditional discharge. But for God's sake, do a runner now, because the stipe's on, and he's a no-nonsense, tough magistrate. He knows that you're a couple of rogues and he's going to send you down. That is how justice works in Britain. Everybody knows it. It punishes everybody except the guilty. And it's not going to change unless there are really revolutionary changes in the practice all the way down. We've got a justice minister. What is she doing? She should be addressing issues like this. But you can bet your bottom dollar nothing is going to change fast under Labour or Conservative, because the system is like the QE2. It's got enormous inertia. It's going to keep on sailing the direction it's set in. It's going to take major revolutionary changes to get it to change. And there's no incentive in the system to change the system. They're going to carry on like this because at the end of the day, it's only the ordinary person that suffers as a result of it, and we don't count.
Yeah, I mean, you can draw this directly back to car crime, where only 1% of car crime at the moment is currently actually charged, the people who have committed that crime. So it's essentially become this world of, we're not trying to stop crime anymore. We're not trying to stop car crime. All that happens is the police come around to your house, they give you a crime reference number, you take that to your insurance company checks if you didn't leave your car keys in the ignition, and they basically just pay out. So it's just this big revolving thing where it's become almost too difficult, too much work for them to even come round and, do a bit of investigation as to what's actually happened, which is really ridiculous considering how many CCTV cameras there are and stuff around these days.
They're doing less. There are more policemen. There are actually more policemen than there ever have been, but they are doing less work. I mean, to give you another case in point, people often say, "Oh, I can't pass judgment on shoplifters. After all, Tesco's and Waitrose and Aldi and Lidl, they can stand the losses." Well, of course they don't stand the losses. They pass the losses on to you, the customer. You're paying for that shoplifter. He's stealing, or she's stealing more often, from your pocket. All the companies do is translate those losses which occur through their own staff stealing, through shrinkage and so on, all they do is translate those losses into increased prices and goes out of your pocket. So don't feel sorry for shoplifters. They're stealing from you just as much as anybody else. So it's this illogicality. It's the same with the car crime. If you say, oh, well, it's only a car, you won't say that when you get your insurance bill, because you are paying for all those crimes. The insurance companies are not going to take a loss. They just pass the cost on to you, and you pay for it when you renew your insurance. So those thieves are stealing from your pocket.
Look at what happened with the fuel, you know. As soon as there was any kind of inkling that there was going to be fuel shortages, you know, the prices went straight back, you know, straight through the roof, you know, £2.10 a litre. And all right, granted, it's come back down to like 180, 186 or whatever. But we've had, you know, BP have had record profits. Eon have had record profits this year. But none of that comes back to us, does it? That doesn't get reflected back.
The prices won't go down again when the price of fuel, of the raw fuel, unprocessed at the refinery, when that goes down, when the world market for oil goes down, you won't suddenly see a reduction in prices at the pump. They'll say, oh, it's in the system, you know, we've got to wait for it to filter through. But there's never any filtering through when prices go up overnight, because there's been a blip in the spot markets, et cetera, et cetera. Even if the big companies aren't buying off the spot markets, they've got their own supplies, thank you very much. So the market price is a different thing altogether. But again, we are a society of consumers. Imagine what it was like when you actually grew your own food and had your own horse and all the rest of it. It's a different world, but essentially now we are totally at the mercy of whatever the big companies choose to price their products and goods to us. And the same with the energy people. One of the things as nationalists we would insist on is that all utilities are taken back into British ownership. Now, it's not the same as nationalisation. I don't mean to say that we put all gas and all electric and all water and everything else under a mega corporation run by the state, because that would probably be worse than any individual corporation. It'd be so big it'd afford to ignore any consumer protest, because that would be the monopoly of the industry. What I'm saying is it should be in British ownership, because we've got a situation now where so many utilities are owned by foreign companies who export the profits. They charge more to the British consumer than they do to the consumer in their own countries. Why? Because they simply see us as a cash cow to be mined. When you learn later that the water pipes are all pouring water out at a fantastic rate, well, they have no interest in looking after the water supply. It's not their water supply. It's our water supply, built largely in the Victorian era. And if it's springing leaks and so on, well, that's our problem. But they're reinvesting their profits, which should be used for the maintenance and upkeep of the system, back in their own countries. Well, we should stop that. We should say, we don't care which company runs Water South or whatever. We just care that it's a British company that is investing in Britain in the long term, that knows that its future is tied up with Britain, and that if it doesn't do its job right, the British consumers will be straight on the line to them saying, I'm taking my business elsewhere. One of the obvious reasons why water doesn't work in Britain is if you only have one supplier in your region, well, you're stuck with them. But I mean, if we're going to have competition, the competition has got to be one where you might have half a dozen companies, like in the case of gas electric, any one of which you can ring up and say, I'm changing from Water South to Water South plus 2. You know what I mean? If there is no competition, because basically you take the water or you do without, then you've got no effective competition. Now, we all know that the energy companies can run cartels, but that's what we're supposed to have monitoring bodies for, to make sure there aren't cartels and there is genuine competition. But at the moment, it seems that the government simply isn't interested in making sure there is real, effective competition in all industries. But one of the ways to do it would be to exclude foreigners whose sole interest is in mining this country for profit and exporting them. That must stop. That is a nationalist policy. We run our services for our benefit alone.
Brilliant. Well, that would be a policy that I would be behind 110%. Jim, we are getting on for an hour and 55 minutes. Would you be okay to go through a few questions from other nationalists?
Up at some point. Okay.
Would that be okay? I mean, we can continue on if you like. I just try to keep these things at about 2 hours because, attention spans and things can be a bit. People struggle to stay on ball for this long, But I'm hoping the conversation's been good enough to keep them entertained and things. But no, all really good points. I think you're a brilliant guy. I really do, honestly. You're just the sort of people that I would like to see in a political party. So, even just talking to you more now has just reinforced that sort of feeling for me, and I imagine it has done for a lot of the people watching as well, which is really good, Jim. And you're a very kind of very approachable guy and very easy to talk to as well. I could easily let this run on for sort of 3 or 4 hours quite easily. You're such an interesting guy, and I've heard your knowledge on brandy is exceptional as well. So I'd really like to talk to you about that at some point too. I think we've gone through most of the things. Just very quickly. So with regards to the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum, if your political party got into power, would you sever all ties with these two organizations?
The World Health Organization, the latest dictatorial attempts to override national governments, totally intolerable. There's no way we want the national health policy of this country to be dictated to by the WHO, if only because we have our suspicions that the WHO is merely the patsy of the Chinese government, who have more than enough control over it. As for the World Economic Forum, that's an entirely different kettle of fish. We know who they are. They're the sort of global capitalists gather together for a sort of shindig and so on. But the question is how much, to what extent is this basically a gigantic cartel? I believe there's a quote on Adam Smith in which he says that if you see a group of people in a similar business all confabbing, it can only be to the detriment of the ordinary person, because they will doubtless be confabbing with a view to extracting the maximum profits out of everybody else. There is always a reason why people from a similar background and industry are having a conversation with each other, and it's usually not for looking out for the good of you and me. So the WF is there, obviously, to look after the interests of the global capitalists. What I'd be more suspicious about is why various princes turn up there. What business is it of theirs? They should be looking after the national interest. They're supposed to, on accession to the throne, say they will defend the sovereignty of the state and their own rights as monarchs. How is that compatible with selling us out to foreigners? Not very. They shouldn't even be talking to them, in my opinion. But of course, they've got their own agendas. And in some cases, like a certain prince, they think they've got a sort of a great vision into the environment, which none of the rest of us possess. And they've got to keep lecturing us about it all the time. So they're going to go and lecture these rich men about the environment or something, etc., etc. But to my mind, this is a gang of rich men getting together to decide how to, for want of a better word, screw us harder and faster and better in order to maximize their profits. So why would we want to speak to them? I agree. They have their interests. The national interest is something quite different. It's like the whole business about zero net growth. What is the point of us tinkering with the 1% that we contribute to global carbon emissions if the Chinese are building a power station every year, and they insist that they are going to carry on, and you can see to a certain extent you can be sympathetic with them, we are going to carry on building power stations and airfields and other infrastructure until we achieve a standard of living comparable with yours. The trouble is, if every country in the world is entitled to say that, well, we're not going to last the decade, never mind till 2050 or 2060. There simply aren't enough resources for everybody to have a middle-class Western existence. But if countries the size of China and India say that's what we're going to do, then there's absolutely no point in us cutting our own throats and inflicting a self-denying ordinance on us, because it's not going to have the slightest effect. We are not going to change the world's climate by our self-denying if countries the size of China and India are going to ignore it. What they're basically saying is, we're going to look after ourselves. If you're mug enough not to, well, that's your funeral. But we have to stand up to these bullies and say, we too are entitled to look after our interests. I'm afraid at the end of the day, my suspicions are it will end with a series of global wars which will make World Wars I and II look like the Vicarage Tea Party. But that is the traditional human response to too many people, not enough resources, is we fight each other. That's why we have to have good defences, because if that's how it's going to be decided, we have to be able to look after our interests as well as other larger countries are going to be to look after theirs. If push comes to shove, we have to be capable of shoving back. Otherwise, our future is a black one.
I agree, 100%. Yep, I do. This is why the whole run into the woods thing just isn't an option for me, because if everyone runs to the woods and we all just kind of give up on the political side of things, I mean, the best case scenario is we get invaded in 10 years' time once everyone gives up. These are the realities of the situation, aren't they? Again, all very good points, Jim. Really appreciate that. That's very much again along the same sort of along my sort of thoughts with these things. Really, I mean, in layman's terms, I'm just a mere decorator, but I do try to sort of comprehend these things as best as I can. It's always nice to have it complemented by a man who's clearly more intelligent than myself. I was hoping, could I ask you a few questions from other nationalists? Is that okay? Just very quickly before we wrap up. Okay.
That's what I'm here for.
Brilliant. So we have, the first one was from PH on Telegram, and he said, at what point does a Pakistani or Somalian become British? Is Priti Patel British? Is it just a piece of paper or a passport I need to become British? And then he sort of yammers on, but I think you get the grasp of the question.
Well, I don't think a Somalian or other ethnic ever becomes totally British. There are a very, very, very small handful of people, mostly going back to sort of Raj days, who were brought up. I mean, people forget that Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Indira Gandhi were so anglicised they practically didn't understand anything about their own people. It's a little known fact that Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, was happiest discussing English literature, drank whiskey like a fish, and had numerous illicit affairs. He was that anglicised. Indira Gandhi and the rest of the Gandhi-Nehru dynasty, again, were so out of touch with their own people, they didn't foresee the Hindu-Muslim massacres of the partition, because they no longer understood the common man's perception of his religion. They were so anglicised, they had a sort of an aloof churches on Sundays approach to religion. They didn't understand that for millions of people, being Hindu or being Indian was something you killed over. You see what I mean? Now, that doesn't change just because people come to Britain. There are very few people I can think of, for example, just give me a second. There's a couple of speakers on GB News who appear to me to have been so thoroughly anglicised that I would individually grant them citizenship on the grounds that they had become effectively one of us, even though they have brown skins. But for the vast majority of immigrants, I wouldn't say they ever become British. And the more of them come, the more they will tend to dwell in their own enclaves. The whole point is, how many of them ever have any contact with Britain or British people anymore? They live in their own enclaves, they dress in their own clothes, they eat their own food, they live their own lives. They are in Britain, but not of Britain. Calling them Britons is absolutely farcical. They are at best, technically, legally, citizens of the United Kingdom. Personally, I would make citizenship coterminous, contiguous with nationality. I would go back to the jus sanguinis. I would say only British nationals, people of British descent, should be awarded British citizenship and have the right to vote, the rest of it. For the rest, well, you go back to ancient Greece, you had the citizens, you had the helots in some cases. Remember, all ancient Greece was slave-owning societies. So you had helots or slaves. Even Athenian democracy, the citizens with the vote owned slaves who could be imported from anywhere in the known world. The urban police in Athens were Scythian archers who were basically state slaves. But in between, you had a class of people called metoikoi, those who dwell among us, those who dwell with us, met-oikoi. The oikoi is the same root as in an economy. Metoikoi, metics. They were people who were not citizens, but not serfs or slaves, who were dwellers with us, co-residents, but not co-citizens. So I think we have to create a category of resident foreigner. Now, it doesn't mean to say they're going to be kept in dark dungeons and fed bread and water. They might have all the economic advantages. They might have, everything except, I think, voting rights. They wouldn't serve in the armed forces, I don't think, because he wouldn't want to be defended by somebody who you might be at war with, etc. But I think we have to rethink getting back to a nation state, where the nation consists of a homogeneous citizen body who have interests in common because of Hamilton's law. Hamilton's law is a biological law that you look after people that you share genes with. You don't look after people quite so much who you don't share genes with. That includes the people on water aid. After a while, you think, wait a minute, little so-and-so is short of water. Well, what's his government doing about that? We give that government lots of aid. Where's it going? Why is it going on pipes for little so-and-so? It's not going on pipes for little so-and-so because the government minister responsible is taking the money and putting it in his pocket. You see another video that says that little Samira is at risk of being molested and sold into child slavery and prostitution. Hang on a minute. Why is that our problem? This country has a government, does it not? What's its government doing about child prostitution and little Samira being kidnapped and abducted and all the rest of it? Doesn't the police have some responsibility for her? Why are we stepping in as the white saviour to fill a gap which should be filled by the country in question? We should be asking these questions. Getting back to that original point, you see my point. These people coming into this country have their own traditions, their own customs, their own interests. And if they eventually, heaven forfend, become the majority, then we will be at the receiving end of their customs and traditions and habits, which may not be to our liking, because they may not have a Christian attitude towards minorities. They might have an attitude that those minorities who Allah has granted to us as our subjects are to be treated in accordance with the Quran. They will pay a dhimmi fee, a jizya. They will be our subjects, and we're entitled to do with them as we choose. So we don't want that future for ourselves. We are entitled to look after ourselves by protecting ourselves. And I think the first protection is to make citizenship co-terminus with the nationality, the ethnicity of the people. And we create a category of resident foreigners, of metics, so that people who have dwelt here for years and want to carry on living here and pay their taxes and all the rest of it, we don't expel them, but we do insist that they do not have full voting rights. We certainly don't want the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, and various other ministers to be people of foreign extraction. After all, to turn the argument around, can you imagine that India would have as Chancellor of the State of India, as as defence minister, as interior minister, an Englishman who'd arrived since the Raj, just sort of drifted in, and because he came from a well-off background and went to the right universities, the rest of it, and joined the right political party. Can you imagine a political party in India accepting an Englishman just coming in on? Well, I can tell you for a start that Indian immigration laws are extremely tough. You cannot immigrate to India very well unless you're a millionaire, and even so, you'll be regarded as a resident foreigner. You'll be regarded as a man living in India, paying his taxes, but not an Indian. So why should we have a different rule from the people coming to us as us going to them? Surely there should be some reciprocity. We will treat them exactly the way they treat us, so there's no grounds for complaint on that score. We're not imposing rules on them which they don't impose on us.
The thing is, this is quite consistent anywhere out of the Western world. You know, Thailand is exactly the same. You know, if you even if you move and emigrate to Thailand, if you have children with a Thai lady, you can never, ever be a first class citizen there. You will always be a third, fourth, or maybe second if you do really well and sort of marry well and whatever. But yeah, I mean, this is all pretty common stuff out of the Western world.
Some time ago to I can't remember, it's Yorkshire Forum or whatever, pointing out that people still seem to have this quaint belief in Francis Fukuyama's prediction that the future is Western liberalism. That is the end point of history. Remember, his point was that the end of history was Western liberalism. There was nothing beyond that. Well, it's absolute drivel. I think even Fukuyama admits that. The Chinese and the Indians are not going to adopt Western liberalism. That is why racism, sexism, ableism, disableism, casteism, and everything else are safe for the next few millennia, because the countries which are going to dominate the next century, India, China, Brazil, Russia, they're not going down the Western liberal route. Eventually, we are the tail on the dog. We may think we're otherwise, but we are going to have to adapt to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is not going to adapt to us. It's because we watch so much junk films coming out of Hollywood that they always portray, you know, everything in America is wonderful. There's always one white cop and one black cop, and they're the best of friends. Everybody lives in middle class. There are no poor people in America. You know, you watch an American TV series, you watch an American film, there is nobody who is poor, nobody who is hard up, despite the fact a quarter of the population live in poverty. But Hollywood churns out fantasy, and it gives the impression that the rest of the world, because it likes watching this fantasy out of sheer amusement, is going to turn into a replica of America. Well, it isn't. Most of the world looks at America with horror and says, my God, we don't want to end up like that, do we? And it says, thank God we're China and we're never going to become something like that. Thank God we're India and we're never going to become something like that. Yes, we watch their films out of amusement when we're not watching Bollywood or the Chinese state films, but that's out of amusement. We certainly don't want to turn into that. And we know it's all drivel and fantasy anyway, because we know the real America, which we see on the TV screens during the documentaries and the news in action, where we see the race riots and the rest of it, we don't want to end up like that. So we're going to keep ethnically homogenous because, thank you very much, we don't want race riots in our neighborhood very much. Goodbye, you know. And that is what the rest of the world thinks of adopting our policies on immigration. It thinks they're nuts. It thinks that they think that we're nuts, and they're not going to go down the same path. And eventually, we're going to learn the lesson that we're going to have to adapt to them, because they're going to be the dominant forces in the next century, not Western liberalism.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really do. Yeah, I think that's the well, I think it's balmy anyway. You know, I think it starts right here. This is where it.
We feel guilty about colonialism and the Second World War, as if other countries hadn't been colonialist. India's been colonialist. China's been colonialist. All these other countries have been, one of the world's greatest empires. Egypt, all these countries, are they beating their breasts and tearing down statues of famous Turks and Egyptians and Indians and Chinese, saying, whoa, we should never have colonized the rest, we should never have been imperial powers, we should never have built huge palaces with slave labor, we're going to tear them all down and to hell with the tourists. No, they're not riddled with guilt, but they had empires, same as we had empires. They had slave trades, just as we had slave trades. African countries like Dahomey profited from the slave trade. Are they going to disown that? No, they are not. So why do Western liberals uniquely hate themselves? Well, read Douglas Murray's book, War on the West. It's the best book to come out this year, and I recommend it to everybody. Read Douglas Murray, War on the West. It's an absolute must-buy, an absolute must-read. But it points out that this self-flagellation of the West, by the West, is again steered by Marxists start and finish. It's designed to soften us up so that we're a fragmented, disunited, distrustful society, ripe for the takeover by the handful of Marxist extremists who think that if they can destabilize our society enough, eventually it'll fall into their grasp. Remember, the October Revolution, or November Revolution, depending on your calendar, was not a Russian revolution. It was a revolution led by everybody but the Russians. There was only one ethnic Russian in the revolutionaries, the old Bolsheviks. The Russian peasant revolution had already happened in the spring. That was the revolution which brought to power constitutional Democrats and social Democrats and Kerensky, and wanted to continue the war against Germany. What happened in October, November, which is presented as the Russian Revolution, was a seizure of power and a coup by a handful of people of a certain ethnicity, mostly, given us their addresses, the Lower Manhattan district of New York, financed by a Czech from Loeb and Company, financed by a check written by Jacob Schiff. The whole thing was a coup carried out over the heads of the Russian people. One of the first things it did, of course, was to massacre and persecute the Russian Orthodox Church, seen as the repository of traditional values. So it was an anti-Russian revolution, and something similar is being prepared all over the Western world. It's an attempt to break up all the traditional bonds which hold societies together. And immigration is one of the chief weapons, because you saturate these societies with foreigners. People don't end up knowing who their own neighbor is. You break these societies down and they're ripe for the takeover. I don't believe Mr. Putin is behind that. It's something much more long-lasting than him. It's a cancer in our own midst. And what Douglas Murray is saying is, if we don't challenge this cancer and ideally cut it out, it will destroy us. But it's achieving success every time some transgender person, extremist, persecutes J.K. Rowling. This is all part of the same strategy of isolating and persecuting and victimizing people simply for holding common sense views. J.K. Rowling, for instance, simply says a woman is an adult human female. And they're trying to stop her saying that. And she's sticking up for herself. And so are lots of other people, like Brian Linehan, that was on TV the other night. And these people are being singled out for persecution. And it's our job to stand by them and say, we know what your game is. You're trying to break up the bonds which hold society together. Bonds of family, principally. You're trying to isolate and destroy the family, because Trotsky told you, if you destroy the family, you can then get control of society. That's what their game is, and we must challenge it and stop it.
I can't agree enough. Again, I'm agreeing with you a lot, just to make it interesting. So are we ready for another question?
Yes.
This one comes from Freedom for Britain, which is not actually the organisation Freedom for Britain, but it's an activist. I think it's one of their top activists. So he has asked, will you be standing candidates in parliamentary elections, i.e. general elections or by-elections? Otherwise, it's just like For Britain, a party only interested in local elections.
No, we will not. And we are like For Britain in the sense that we think you must learn to walk before you can run. Nobody in current nationalist parties is prepared for being an MP because we have no experience. We would be absolutely eaten alive by the professionals because we wouldn't know what to do on arriving as an MP, even if we somehow got an MP elected, given the manifest unfairness of the first past the post system. The best we can hope for the foreseeable future is to get district councillors elected. When I was elected as a district councillor back in 2004, I had absolutely no idea of what went on in council chambers other than speechifying in full council. I learned the hard way, and we are now in a position to give advice to would-be councillors, to candidates, as to what they should do once elected. And we know something about, after years of campaigning, we know something about how to get them elected. But to aspire to get somebody into Parliament, A, it isn't going to happen, and B, if it did happen, we'd simply make fools of ourselves because we wouldn't know what to do. Remember that if we just got a single MP elected, he wouldn't even be able to propose and second his own motions, so he would be achieving absolutely nothing. We have to be in a position where we can elect a significant body so that they can actually have some impact. And we're so far from that it's just idle to even discuss it. I've already said to you, but not on the air as far as I know, that there is yet a lower rung which is not being taken advantage of, which is parish councillors. Parish councillor positions are very often not filled and will be filled by co-option without even an election holding place. We have a couple of parish councillors and we have some in prospect. And I would urge all nationalists watching this podcast to consider standing as parish councillors, because you will learn something about negotiating with other people. Most parish councillors are not actually members of political parties. They tend simply to be concerned citizens who want to do the right thing by their neighbourhood. To stand for a parish councillor, you have to be living within 3 miles of the parish council. So it excludes people being parachuted in, and that discourages a lot of professional politicians. You will largely be surrounded by possibly not very clued up, but well-meaning people from your own neighbourhood. Now, if you can't convince them to carry out policies which are in line with nationalist thinking, then you're not very good at the job. But it's the first step in learning how to compromise, how to negotiate with people, how to get a good deal. And if you can do that, then you're eligible to move up to the next rung of district councillor. But being a district councillor isn't about shouting nationalist slogans at people. You'll get nowhere doing that. You have to learn to sit in a room with people with discordant views and argue with them and compromise with them and negotiate with them to get the best deal you can get. Believe you me, if we manage to get a body of a few hundred of those in the next decade, we'll be doing well. At the moment, that's not even conceivable. To get a significant body of councillors that will cause governments to think, oh, we better not go ahead with that, or we'll get the nationalists voting against us. That's going to take a long time to achieve, even at district council level. But it's a snowball effect. The more we manage to get district councillors elected, the more people will have confidence in us. At the moment, there's no reason for them to vote for us for MP, because they can say, these people, what have they ever run? Nothing. Why should we trust them with the keys to the kingdom? Of course not. You've got to show that you're competent at the district level, at least of being a challenging councillor, saying, what are we doing about grooming in this district? You've got to be capable of doing that before we can even think of getting an MP elected. But once we've got a significant body of district councillors, and once we think, well, there is an area where we've got so many district councillors elected, we could very well get an MP elected, because, look, we've got 5 out of his 6 wards covered now with district councillors of our own. That means essentially a majority of the electors in that district, in that constituency, are already voting for us as district councillors. Let's go for it. Let's go for MP. But we've got to build up to that. It's going to take time. It's got to be done brick by brick, not by fell swoops, which will merely make us look ridiculous. So that's my answer to your question is, yes, we're going to stick with the district councillor and the parish councillor level for the foreseeable future until things change.
Thank you. That's apart from anything, really good advice to people, and very very well put as well. I mean, this has been my argument with a lot of people for a long time. And this is something that we've pushed since the inception of the INN, is to go for these positions, for these low-level positions, because make no mistake, sorry, Jim, it feels a little bit disingenuous repeating this to you, because I know we spoke about this before actually starting the stream, but I think it is such an important part to sort of add to it, that this is how we have lost so much, because we've ignored these little positions, we've ignored these parish positions, we've ignored these council positions, and they've been taken over by people who probably don't have our best interests at heart, or at the very least our people's interests at heart. So, you know, in order for us to win this fight back, you know, we have to fight back at those little building blocks first, you know, these little positions and everything else. So yeah, I completely agree with that. Let's learn to sort of walk properly before we can run. I think that's really, really great advice. I've got one final question, but I don't think I'm going to ask it, because, to be honest with you, James, I think you've covered it really well in your 20-minute video. So I'm actually going to message that guy and say, just go and watch the video, because you do explain it. But if you do want to put anything to it, yeah, go on. We'll ask it as we're here. What makes the British Democrats any different from all the other nationalist and centre-right political parties who have failed? And how will you combat smears, censorship, hate-mongering that scares many people away from getting involved?
Well, the first thing is we've tried to keep good parts of the BNP and all previous nationalist parties. We've tried to keep the strategy, the ambition, the policies which are directed towards making Britain a great nation state again. But we have tried to avoid the mistakes. There were, if you look at the history of nationalist politics, it's largely a history of mistakes and failures caused by bad leadership, caused by egoists, and in some cases people who are well-meaning, like John Tyndall, but sometimes had rather unfortunate way of talking down to people and so on. And it's by other people who have rather less noble reasons for the way they behave. But we've tried to design a constitution which empowers the membership, which empowers local leadership, so that local leaders can be given the resources to pursue campaigns for local interest. We don't try to steer from the centre, as it were. The leader does not have control of the judiciary, so he can't just sack people because he doesn't like them or because they stand up to him. There's got to be due process, and it's not under his control. He doesn't control the treasury. There is transparency of accounts and so on. In other words, we've tried to avoid the mistakes into which previous parties have fallen. We've tried to design a constitution which, as far as is humanly possible, will prevent most of the errors which have crippled parties in the past. The BNP was never defeated. Farage likes to claim that the UKIP, his UKIP party, defeated the BNP, took its voters away from it. No, he didn't. BNP self-destructed largely because of bad leadership, culminating in large numbers of the members feeling that they were better off outside it than inside it. We don't want to repeat that. We haven't got the time to repeat the mistakes of the past. So we've tried to design a constitution which empowers the membership and isn't an authoritarian top-down dictatorship as we've experienced in the past. We try to avoid factionalism, egoism, and all that sort of thing. That's what's different. And a lot of thinking has gone into this by experienced people like Andrew Bronze and Adrian Davies. They have been members of other parties, so they've seen the rise and fall of the National Front. They've seen the rise and fall of the BNP. They can say, why did they go wrong? What was wrong about their constitutions? How was this unable to occur? Can we prevent this from happening in future? There's nothing like the experience of a man like Andrew Bronze, who's been a nationalist since his teens and has been through the triumphs and the disasters, and can reflect on them, and can therefore provide the wisdom of accumulated experience for the benefit of the British Democrats. And that's the whole point, is that you have a guiding hand that knows what it's doing. It's not just a party built round one ego saying, I am going to be the great leader, and you are going to be my followers. And yes, I'm all in favour of nationalist unity. I'm going to be the one man in charge of that unity, and the rest of you are just going to follow like sheep. We can't afford any more of that sort of nonsense. We can't have little ego-based parties. And if that means that people have to work for the common good by sitting around in a committee room and saying, what's the mood of the conference? Which way are we going to go? I can't see any other way of working. We are happy to work with other parties. We don't proclaim that we are the sole voice of nationalism, that everybody who isn't a member of our party isn't. Yeah, Jim, we got cut off. I think that was nature's way of telling us you've talked for long enough.
I just said the same thing to the audience.
Yeah, I think I answered the chap's point. I would merely like to thank everybody with the patience to watch this podcast for participating, because it's been enjoyable for me too. You might think it's just an opportunity for me to spout, but I've enjoyed basically being asked questions which I've had to think about. I mean, the question about at what point does a Somali become a Briton, was sort of, whoa, wow, that's quite a strong one. You know what I mean? And similarly, some of the other questions, they did make me think, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to indirectly or directly speak to other nationalists. But final point, I would urge everybody to bring things like GB News and Talk TV and try and get their points across. Because again, you can't say that the system is failing or the parties are no good if you don't make an effort yourself. And the simplest effort is to pick the phone up and just protest about the number of migrants arriving, because GB News and Talk TV, unlike other channels, will listen to you. They will say, yes, you're quite right. We're concerned too. The others, of course, will simply banish you from the airwaves.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd second that 100%, and I think we need to make. We used to have I don't know if you've ever heard of the Groypers, but they were primarily sort of to essentially troll radio stations like talk radio and things, and they would get on and sort of play the game for a few minutes until they get through the period of time that you need before they can cancel you, before you sort of overshot that, and then they would start talking about 2066 and things like that, and that was a really clever way of getting around things. But yeah, I mean, I guess the sort of the underhandedness doesn't need to be, does it? You can just call in and talk about reasonable sort of discussion points.
One question I would ask of all nationalists is, when do we start using the term Great Replacement? I gather that 60% of Republicans in America believe in Great Replacement theory. At what point do we let it surface instead of speaking about immigration? Because immigration is such a vague term. It can mean, on the one hand, a migrant worker coming from Poland to pick fruit and then go back after 5 years to build a house in Krkowice or something, or it can mean somebody who's coming here with the intention of settling and having 16 kids and putting them all on benefits. There's everything in between. Immigration is a very vague term. Again, when you hear terms like net immigration, implying that it's all right if 1 million people arrive and 500,000 leave. And as Jim Callaghan said, yeah, but they're not the same people leaving as they're arriving. It's the white people who are fleeing to other parts of the world where they fondly imagine they'll have a better life, not the same people arriving. At what point do we actually say, look, what we're talking about is replacement, displacement, not just immigration? Immigration sounds like we're adding on a few people. Well, all the Bradfordians living in Bridlington, or the people from Hull living in Holderness or whatever, they aren't there because they wanted to. They're there because they've been displaced. They've been ethnically cleansed out of places where their grandparents used to live, which were homogeneously English largely, because it's more an English phenomenon than Welsh, Scottish or Northern Irish. At what point do we simply say the English people are being kicked out of their homeland? It's no good saying, oh, well, they're migrating to Australia or Canada or New Zealand. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, not the same as Britain. And in them, they're going to be a minority too. So they're not actually changing very much. They're not achieving some promised land. Should we start talking right across the nationalist board about displacement, because it's no good just one party pioneering it as a scoring point on the others. We all have to do it homogeneously so that the enemy, the system, faces a coherent barrage of criticism, and they can't get round it by saying, oh, well, it's only the British Democrats that talk about displacement or replacement theory. Everybody else doesn't even use that term. So that's how useful it is. It's just one of their little tricks. No, we've all got to do it systematically and agree that we are facing the extinction of the English people in the long run. We've got to remember the 14 words. We've got to remember that if we all stick together, even if we belong to different parties, but if we stick together in pursuit of a common ambition, possibly by different routes, then we're achieving something. But if we feud among ourselves, we're getting nowhere.
Agreed. Wow, this has been one of the best podcasts I've ever done, I've got to be honest with you, Jim. I hope everything's come out of the other end okay, because you never really know with these things in YouTube. You know, sometimes you can get a bit of feedback and stuff, you know, and sometimes the voices don't come out so good, but we tested it as well as we could, so I hope it's all gone well. Honestly, hand on heart, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I know it's been a bit overdue and kind of difficult. I think we both had to race back for this one, didn't we? Just because it's the only time we could do it. But this is what we have to do as nationalists, as committed nationalists. You know, you have to make the time. You know, most people will make excuses. You know, a good activist will make time.
Well, I look forward to another occasion, but heaven knows when it'll be, because we all have busy lives. I know I've got a shift for the next 20 nights or something. By the way, I didn't answer one part of the last question, which is how you're going to cope with all the hate and all the rest of it. Well, we're just going to grow thick skins, but then we've got pretty thick skins anyway after 20 years in the business. The idea, I think Le Pen is the ultimate proof of this, that if you tone things down and move into the centre and soften your rhetoric, things will get better, is absolute rubbish. All it'll do is that you'll lose your core supporters because they'll lose faith in you. But you're not going to get any softer ride from the mainstream media because they hate us to death. The only thing that would please them is if we fell under a bus. The idea that if we soften up that we will get brownie points from the centrists or the system or the establishment is absolute drivel. Anybody that thinks that, oh, if we just put things in a kinder way and don't offend people, everything will be all right, is rubbish. It's the opposite is true. We will get more brownie points by speaking the truth, speaking out, being outspoken, being honest, because people can tell when you're not telling them the truth. People can look at Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss and say, they've just read the latest polls on what's the correct thing to say about this, that, or the other, and they're just spouting it because their political advisors have said, say this, say that. No, we will get further forward if we speak the truth, we speak honestly, and people can tell that we're speaking honestly. They can look us in the face and say, that man is saying what he really believes and really thinks, I think I'll vote for him. Because remember, a lot of them do think what we think, but they're scared stiff of saying so. If they can see that we are not afraid to say so, then they'll have more, not less, confidence in us. And there's millions of people out there waiting for a sign of life from some political party that's not just going to spout the same old gibberish. And we have to provide that.
I agree. And I think our arguments are good. I really do. You know, we've been refining these for a long old time now. I mean, obviously, I've only been in this sort of movement, I guess, for the past sort of 4 years or so. But, you know, this is kind of what we've done for the past 4 years is sort of argue with people on the internet and Telegram and things. And, you know, that refines your art. It refines your artillery, as it were.
Yeah,
and I think it's ready.
Open discussion, because we might just win it. We'll certainly win the audience over. So we must not be allowed to present our logical arguments openly. That's why we must take advantage of Talk TV and GB News, because they're the only people who at least allow us to get our points across, even through talk-ins and so on. And then eventually, when the momentum builds up, they might be forced to invite us and not Richard Tice to be their resident alternative voice. But as long as they can get away with Richard Tice, who really is standing for sort of something and nothing, I mean, civic nationalism, what is it? But he's the most they can allow at the moment without getting shut down by the authorities. So be grateful for small mercies, but let's build on that and try and move it along till one day even we could appear on TV.
Fingers crossed. Oh, we don't even need fingers crossed. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, Jim. We've got this. It's going to be fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Joe.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming along. Really do appreciate it, Jim. It's been exceptional. I've really enjoyed it. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. Much appreciated. We will be doing a lot more of these podcasts in the not so distant future. The big problem at the moment is just finding the time to do them, but we have got about 10 that are all lined up and ready to go. So yeah, we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Guys, have a great day. Enjoy yourselves. Be safe. Keep fighting the system. Keep doing everything that you're doing. And obviously either join the INN or join the British Democrats with our Jim and everyone else. So yeah, thanks very much. Have a great day, guys. We'll see you soon. Thanks very much.
Bye now.